Hi guys, and welcome to a relaxing history time. Tonight we step out into a night so cold it feels almost personal. The prairie stretches around you in every direction, flat and endless, silvered by moonlight and crusted with snow that crunches beneath your boots. The wind does not simply blow, it prowls. It circles you, testing your coat seams and slipping curious fingers down the back of your collar. You pull your scarf tighter and immediately understand something uncomfortable. You probably will not survive this without preparation. The Old West was not all golden sunsets and slow horse rides. In winter, especially across the Great Plains during the late 19th century, temperatures routinely plunged far below freezing. That is a straightforward historical reality. Weather records from frontier forts show nights dipping well under 0 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes for days at a time. There were no thermostats to tap, no electric blankets humming politely in the background. There was you, the wind, and whatever you managed to build before darkness settled in. You stand in the open and feel how quickly warmth leaves your body. It is almost shocking. Your breath blooms in front of you in pale clouds that vanish as quickly as they appear. The air smells clean but sharp, almost metallic, the scent of ice and distant wood smoke carried from some unseen homestead miles away. Every sound feels magnified. The creak of saddle leather, the distant bark of a dog, the faint whistle of wind slipping over grass now stiff with frost. The West you imagine from old films rarely lingers on this part. Yet mainstream historians agree that winter posed one of the most serious threats to settlers and travellers alike. Exposure could kill faster than hunger. It was not dramatic, it was quiet. You would simply grow tired, then sleepy, and the cold would settle in as if it belonged there. You stamp your feet trying to keep blood moving. Even that small motion reminds you how fragile you are out here. Boots freeze stiff, fingers lose feeling first, then toes. The body prioritizes survival in a way that feels almost unfair. Warmth retreats toward the centre, leaving your extremities to bargain with the elements on their own. Some early emigrant diaries describe the sound of trees cracking in the night as sap froze and expanded. It must have been unsettling lying in darkness and hearing the forest split with a rifle-like crack. One quirky tidbit that often surprises people is that some settlers believed these sharp winter sounds were spirits moving through the trees. Folklore travelled easily in the cold when imagination had room to grow. You glance up at the sky, it is painfully clear. Stars crowd the darkness in numbers you rarely see in modern cities. The Milky Way arches overhead like spilled sugar. Beautiful, yes. Comforting, perhaps not. Beauty does not equal mercy. You feel small beneath it, aware that your survival depends less on bravery and more on simple practical decisions. Historians still argue whether the myth of the rugged, self-sufficient cowboy has overshadowed the cooperative reality of frontier survival. Was it truly lone individuals conquering the land, or tightly knit communities pooling knowledge and labour to endure nights like this? Standing here with the wind pressing against you, the answer feels obvious. No one thrives alone in this kind of cold. You turn your back to the wind instinctively. Even that small shift brings relief. The sensation is immediate. The front of your coat stops flapping. The cold still bites, but it does not cut quite as sharply. This is how survival begins. Tiny adjustments. Angling yourself against the worst of it. Learning how the wind moves across the land. The prairie at night is not silent, it hums softly. Snow skitters across crusted drifts with a faint hiss. Somewhere cattle shift in a distant enclosure, their low breath visible in pale puffs. If you listen carefully, you might hear the faint jangle of a loose harness's ring tapping against wood. Each sound is a reminder that life continues despite the temperature. In the 1880s, during what came to be known as the Great Die-Up, brutal winters across the plains killed vast numbers of cattle. That is a documented fact from agricultural records. Ranchers who once believed the open range could sustain herds year-round were forced to reconsider after watching animals freeze or starve beneath snow crusts too thick to break. Winter had a way of correcting overconfidence. You imagine lying down out here without shelter. It is a sobering thought. The snow might look soft, almost inviting, like a white quilt spread across the earth, but it draws heat from you relentlessly. Within minutes, your body would begin to lose its battle. That is the cheeky reality check of the night. Romance does not equal warmth. The wind shifts again and you feel it press against your ears. They sting first, then begin to numb. You reach up and cover them with your hands. Even through gloves, the relief is immediate. It is a small, almost tender gesture protecting the parts of you most vulnerable. You begin to understand that survival on these frozen nights is less about heroics and more about anticipation. You must think ahead. Where will you sleep? How will you trap heat? What will you burn? Out here, fire is not cozy decoration. It is the line between discomfort and disaster. There is a faint glow on the horizon now, perhaps from a cabin window or a small campfire. It flickers, uncertainly buffeted by gusts. That glow feels like hope, distilled into its simplest form. You find yourself moving toward it instinctively. Humans have always been drawn to light in darkness. There is something ancient about it. Before you reach any shelter, though, you must acknowledge the scale of the land itself. The Old West was vast beyond modern comprehension. Settlements could be miles apart, and a storm rolling across the plains could isolate families for days. Some accounts mentioned snowdrifts piling higher than fence posts, transforming familiar paths into featureless white corridors. Yet people survived. They adapted. They learned to read the sky, to sense the drop in pressure that hinted at an incoming blizzard. They built routines around the sun, knowing that once darkness fell, the temperature would plunge even further. You pause for a moment, letting the cold sharpen your awareness. Your eyelashes gather the faintest frost. Each blink feels slightly heavier. You inhale deeply and the air feels almost too crisp, like biting into an apple straight from ice. The night stretches ahead long and unyielding. You know now that surviving it will require more than stubbornness. It will require shelter fire layers and perhaps most importantly foresight. The wind continues to circle you, but you are already thinking beyond this open stretch of prairie. Because in the Old West, frozen nights were not rare events, they were seasonal certainties, and you did not wait until dark to decide how you would face them. The last of the daylight slips away with surprising speed. One moment the horizon glows faintly pink, and the next it hardens into iron grey. You feel the drop in temperature almost immediately, as if someone has quietly turned a hidden dial. This is when urgency replaces contemplation. If you are going to survive the night, you must build something between yourself and that prowling wind. You scan the land with new eyes. A shallow dip in the ground offers slight protection. A cluster of scrub trees leans together as if sharing a secret. Even a wagon angled properly can become the backbone of a shelter. Out here, shelter is rarely perfect. It is improvised, practical, and often temporary. Mainstream historians note that many pioneers traveling the Oregon Trail or settling the plains relied first on their wagons for protection. The prairie schooner was not only transportation, it was bedroom, pantry, and sometimes fortress against storms. Canvas stretched over wooden ribs stiffened by frost could block wind surprisingly well when properly secured. You run your gloved hand along the imagined canvas and feel how it would snap and crackle in the cold. You begin by turning your back to the prevailing wind and positioning your supplies accordingly. The wind usually sweeps across the plains from the northwest in winter. That is a well-documented meteorological pattern. Knowing that direction could mean the difference between a snug camp and a miserable one. You angle the wagon tongue into the gusts, creating a lee side where air edges more gently. Snow crunches underfoot as you work. The sound is sharp and brittle, not the soft, muffled crunch of fresh flakes, but the crisp crack of older snow that has thawed and refrozen. You kneel and start packing snow against the lower edges of the wagon. It seems counterintuitive at first. Snow is cold. Why pile it higher? Yet compacted snow can act as insulation, blocking drafts that would otherwise sneak beneath canvas. There is something oddly calming about the repetition. Scoop, press, smooth. Your breath comes in steady clouds. The smell of cold wood and distant sagebrush lingers in the air. Your fingers ache despite your gloves, a deep dull throb that reminds you time is not infinite. Some travellers dug shallow trenches and lowered their bedrolls slightly below ground level, using the earth itself as a windbreak. It was not elegant, but it was effective. Soil retains heat better than open air. You scrape away snow with a small shovel, exposing frozen ground beneath. The metallic scrape rings out in the quiet dusk. A quirky tidbit from frontier lore suggests that some emigrants believed placing a horseshoe at the entrance of a makeshift shelter would ward off winter misfortune. Whether it truly kept away bad luck is doubtful, but the ritual might have offered psychological warmth. When you are surrounded by uncertainty, even small symbols can steady the mind. Historians continue to debate how prepared most wagon parties truly were for winter's conditions. Some scholars argue that guidebooks and emigrant manuals clearly warned of early snow, while others point out that many travellers underestimated how swiftly seasons could shift on the plains. Standing here with numb fingers, you suspect that optimism sometimes outran experience. You gather kindling next. Dry wood in winter can be scarce, especially after heavy snowfall. You search beneath trees where branches might remain sheltered from moisture. Twigs snap cleanly when bent, a good sign. Damp wood would smoke more than burn, wasting precious effort. The faint scent of resin clings to your gloves as you bundle the sticks. As the sky deepens into indigo, you work faster. There is a rhythm now. Build windbreak, gather fuel, arrange bedding. Each step feels like stacking odds slightly more in your favour. You lay down a thick layer of blankets inside the wagon or against the sheltered side. If you have buffalo robes, you spread them with care for side up to trap warmth. Buffalo robes were highly valued on the frontier. That is a widely acknowledged fact in trade records from the 19th century. Thick and dense, they retained heat even when temperatures plunged. Many settlers purchased them from traders who sourced hides from indigenous hunters. You run your hand across imagined fur and feel its heavy softness, almost luxurious compared to stiff wool. You pause and listen. The wind whistles across open land, but here in the partial shelter you have created, it sounds slightly muted, a small victory. The difference is subtle yet meaningful. It is the difference between constant assault and tolerable chill. You strike a match. The brief flare of sulphur stings your nose sharp and bright. You cup the flame carefully against the wind, feeding it thin twigs. For a moment it sputters uncertainly. Then a steady glow catches. Firelight flickers against canvas walls, painting them in warm gold and trembling shadow. You cannot build a roaring bonfire inside a wagon, of course. Fire must be managed carefully. Many wagon parties cooked outside and relied on heated stones wrapped in cloth to bring warmth into enclosed spaces. It is a simple but clever trick. Stones hold heat surprisingly well. You imagine placing a warmed rock near your feet beneath blankets, feeling gradual comfort seep outward. The temperature continues to fall. You sense it in the way your breath lingers longer in the air. The stars sharpen overhead, their light almost icy. You finish reinforcing weak spots in your shelter, stuffing spare cloth into gaps where drafts sneak through. There is always that moment just before full dark when doubt creeps in. Have you done enough? Is the wind about to shift? Will snow begin falling again? You glance at the horizon, searching for signs. The sky remains clear for now. In the distance, perhaps another faint campfire glows. You imagine others repeating these same tasks, packing snow, tying knots tighter, whispering quiet reassurances to children. The frontier was vast, but on nights like this there many hands perform the same rituals against the same cold. You finally crawl into your prepared space. The air inside feels marginally warmer, though still sharp. You tuck blankets around your shoulders and pull fur close to your chin. Outside, the wind continues its restless wandering, but it no longer has direct access to you. You have not conquered the night. That would be too grand a claim. But you have negotiated with it. You have placed barriers, gathered fuel, created a pocket of resistance in a world determined to strip warmth away. The darkness settles fully now, wrapping the prairie in silver and shadow. Inside your modest shelter, the firelight flickers softly, reflecting in your tired eyes. You know this is only the beginning. Building shelter before sundown is not comfort. It is survival's first quiet promise. The wind presses against your shelter through the night, testing every seam, every knot, every packed ridge of snow. By morning, you understand something clearly. A wagon or temporary lean-to might hold for a journey, but long winters on the frontier demanded something sturdier. And so you find yourself imagining the kinds of homes that dotted the plains and scattered valleys, built quickly, often imperfectly, yet with fierce determination. You step inside a rough cabin just as dusk gathers again. The door thuds shut behind you and the sound alone feels reassuring. The air is cold, yes, but it is still. Stillness is a gift. The walls, made of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and scraps of cloth, block the worst of the wind. The scent of sap and earth lingers in the wood, mixed faintly with smoke from countless fires burned within. Log cabins were among the most common early dwellings for settlers moving westward in the whole 19th century. That is a well-established historical fact supported by land records and homestead claims. Trees were abundant in some regions, especially along rivers, and in mountain foothills, and timber offered a relatively quick building material. You can almost feel the grooves left by an axe in the logs, the slight unevenness where corners were notched by hand. You run your palm along a seam between logs. It is sealed with a mixture of clay straw and sometimes even animal hair. This process, known as chinking, reduced drafts. It was rarely perfect, but it mattered. Even a small gap could allow wind to whistle through like a thin blade of ice. Not all settlers had access to timber, though. On the open prairie where trees were scarce, people turned to sod. You picture thick blocks of prairie grass and soil cut from the earth and stacked like bricks. Sod houses, sometimes called soddies, might not sound inviting yet. They held remarkable insulating properties. Earth absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Inside such a home, temperatures fluctuated less dramatically than outside. There is a quiet irony in that. The very ground you struggled across during the day could become your shield at night. You step into a sod house now in your mind. The walls are thick and slightly damp to the touch. The scent is unmistakable. Rich soil, faintly sweet and loamy. Some newcomers found it unsettling at first, living inside what felt like a carved-out hillside. Others grew to appreciate its practicality. One quirky tidbit often mentioned in letters is that grasses sometimes sprouted from the ceiling after rain. Tiny green shoots poking down as if the prairie were reclaiming its space. Historians still debate whether sod houses were as miserable as some memoirs suggest or more comfortable than nostalgic accounts later claimed. Some argue that hardship narratives were amplified to highlight pioneer resilience. Others believe that modern readers underestimate the psychological strain of living in dim earthen rooms. As you stand inside this imagined shelter, you can sense both on both sides. It is protective, yes. It is also confined. Back in the log cabin, a small window, perhaps no larger than a sheet of paper, admits fading light. Glass was expensive and not always readily available. Some early cabins used oiled paper stretched across frames to allow light in while blocking wind. You picture the way that paper would glow softly when firelight flickered behind it, casting a muted amber hue into the night. The floor beneath your boots creaks slightly. Gaps between planks might let cold air rise from below, so rugs or spare hides are laid across them. Every layer counts. Every barrier matters. You kneel and press your hand against the floor. It feels cold but not biting. Already the structure has taken the edge off the night outside. In one corner stands a simple bed frame, often handmade. A rope or wooden slat base supports a mattress stuffed with straw or feathers, depending on resources. You test the mattress with your hand. It rustles softly, carrying the faint scent of dried grass. It is not luxurious by modern standards, but elevated from the ground it protects against the cold creeping upward from frozen earth. The roof overhead is low. Heat rises, and in a small cabin that matters, you can almost sense how the warmth from a future fire will collect just beneath the rafters trapped in that limited space. Larger homes might feel grander, but small frontier cabins were easier to heat with limited fuel. Fuel itself was precious. In treeless areas, settlers burned twisted buffalo chips, dried bison, dung collected from the plains. It sounds unappealing, yet it was practical and surprisingly efficient. That is a documented practice noted in many frontier journals. The smoke carried a distinctive smell, earthy and sharp, lingering in clothes and hair. You imagine that scent woven into daily life, a reminder of adaptation. The cabin door rattles briefly as wind gusts outside. You feel grateful for thick planks and a sturdy latch. Some families hung quilts or extra hides over doors and windows at night to further reduce drafts. It was a simple trick, yet effective. The soft fabric absorbed small currents of cold air that might otherwise slip through. You take a slow breath. The interior air feels different from outside, less aggressive, less demanding. It carries layers of scent. Wood smoke, wool, perhaps a hint of cooking from earlier in the day. These smells blend into something oddly comforting. There is a softness to this protection. You are no longer exposed on open prairie. The walls create boundaries. The roof defines a ceiling to your world. You can relax just slightly without constant channeling to the horizon. Still, the cold remains a presence. It presses against the walls, waiting for weakness. That awareness never fully disappears. Frontier homes were rarely airtight. Even well-built cabins let in whispers of wind on harsh nights. You might hear faint whistling along a seam, a reminder that nature does not concede easily. You move toward the hearth, knowing that walls alone are not enough. Shelter blocks wind, but fire creates life within it. The structure around you is a vessel. Soon it will hold warmth, light, and the fragile comfort that allows sleep to come. Outside, the prairie stretches under frost and starlight. Inside, you stand in a rough but determined refuge built by hands that understood something essential. Survival in frozen nights was not accidental. It was constructed log by sod choice by deliberate choice. The cabin settles around you with soft wooden sighs as the temperature continues to fall. Walls can block the wind and a roof can hold back snow, but when night deepens and the fire burns low, you learn that survival often comes down to what wraps around your own body. You turn toward the bed where layers wait like quiet guardians. You lift a buffalo robe and feel its weight immediately. It is dense, almost reassuringly heavy, the fur thick and slightly coarse beneath your fingers. In the 19th century, buffalo hides were among the most valued winter coverings on the plains. Trade records from frontier posts show that a good robe could fetch a significant price, especially if taken in midwinter when the fur was at its fullest. The animals themselves were central to the lives of many indigenous nations long before settlers arrived, providing food, shelter, materials, tools, and clothing. Now in your small cabin, that same hide becomes your barrier against the creeping cold. You spread the robe over a base layer of wool blankets. Wool scratches faintly at your knuckles as you smooth it flat. It has a particular scent, clean but earthy, especially when warmed by a nearby fire. Unlike cotton, which turns clammy when damp wool keeps much of its insulating ability, even in less than perfect conditions. That practical quality made it indispensable on the frontier. You sit on the edge of the bed and begin the ritual of layering. First a long undershirt, then another, if you have it. Thick stockings, pulled up carefully, making sure there are no folds to cut off circulation. A knitted cap drawn low over your ears. You move slowly, deliberately. Each layer is a decision. Each one adds a small margin of safety. There is an intimacy to this preparation. The world outside might be vast and indifferent, but here you are tending to yourself with quiet focus. You rub your hands together, feeling warmth build through friction. The cabin air smells faintly of smoke and warm fur. Shadows from the hearth flicker along the log walls, rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. Some settlers filled bed ticks with straw-dried grass or even corn husks when feathers were scarce. It was not luxurious yet, it lifted the sleeper off the cold floor and trapped pockets of insulating air. Letters from homesteaders occasionally mentioned the rustling sound of such mattresses whenever someone turned over at night. You can almost hear it now, a soft whisper beneath the blankets as you shift your weight. There is also a less romantic detail. Bedbugs were an unfortunate reality in many frontier dwellings. Cold weather helped limit them, but they did not vanish entirely. Some families believed that placing certain herbs inside bedding would discourage pests. Whether that worked consistently is uncertain, but the practice appears frequently in household notes and recollections. It is a reminder that even as you guard against freezing temperatures, other small discomforts persist. You lie back and pull the buffalo robe up to your chin. The fur brushes your cheeks, slightly ticklish at first, then soothing. Your breath warms the small pocket of air beneath the covers. Within minutes you can feel the difference. The cold no longer presses so directly against your skin. Instead, it hovers outside your layered cocoon. Researchers continue to examine how much warmth these traditional materials truly retained compared to modern insulation. Some analyses suggest that properly prepared hides and wool offered impressive protection, while others propose that we sometimes overestimate their efficiency through nostalgic lenses. As you settle deeper into the bedding, the debate feels distant. What matters is that the layers create a perceptible shield. You tuck the edges carefully around your shoulders. Drafts are persistent. A small gap near your neck can undo much of your preparation. You adjust, then adjust again until only your nose and mouth remain exposed. The air that enters your lungs feels cold but manageable. Each exhale builds a pocket of humid warmth beneath the robe. There is a subtle soundscape to this moment. The low murmur of fire in the hearth, the faint crackle of sap within a log. Outside, the wind slides along the cabin walls with a hollow, almost ocean-like tone. Inside, your breathing slows. Frontier families often slept several to a bed, especially in smaller homes. Shared warmth was not merely sentimental, it was practical. Two bodies beneath heavy covers generate noticeably more heat than one alone. Some personal diaries describe children positioned between adults during the coldest nights, their small forms protected on either side. You imagine the gentle press of shoulders, the steady rhythm of someone else's breathing nearby. There were also inventive touches. Heated bricks or stones wrapped in cloth were sometimes placed at the foot of the bed. The stones would release warmth gradually through the night. It was a simple technology, yet remarkably effective. You picture sliding your toes towards such a stone, feeling its stored heat seep into stiff muscles. At times, superstition slipped into these nightly rituals. A few communities believed that sleeping with your head toward the north invited colder dreams, while facing east promised better rest. There is no scientific basis for that, of course, yet in a landscape where forces felt immense and unpredictable, orientation could take on symbolic weight. You shift slightly, feeling the straw mattress rustle. The buffalo robe settles around you like a second skin. Your hands, once numb from gathering wood, now begin to tingle gently as circulation returns. The sensation is almost pleasant, a reminder that warmth is reclaiming territory inch by inch. Outside, frost thickens along the window's edge. If you were to rise and touch the glass, it would burn with cold. Instead, you remain still, conserving the pocket of heat you have so carefully built. That is the quiet discipline of frontier nights. Movement wastes warmth. Stillness preserves it. In this said cocoon, you begin to understand something essential. Survival is rarely dramatic in these moments. It is incremental, a thicker blanket, a heavier robe, a cap pulled down snugly. Small acts repeated night after night. The fire will need tending soon. The layers alone cannot hold back the cold until morning. But for now, wrapped in fur and wool, you hover in a narrow zone of comfort carved from a frozen world. The night outside continues its relentless descent in temperature. Inside your bedroll, warmth gathers steady and patient. You lie still for a few minutes, listening to the quiet pulse of the cabin. The warmth beneath your blankets is real but fragile. Already you sense the air cooling as the fire in the hearth settles into a lower glow. Bedding can hold heat close to your body, but without a steady source of flame, the entire room will gradually surrender to the cold pressing at its walls. So you rise. The floor greets your stockinged feet with a chill that makes you inhale sharply. You move toward the hearth, guided by the soft orange shimmer that flickers against the logs. Firelight dances across the walls, stretching and shrinking like a living thing. It is mesmerizing in its own way. Hypnotic. But out here, fire is not entertainment. It is engineering. In most frontier cabins, the fireplace was built of stone or brick, sometimes crudely mortared, sometimes carefully crafted if materials allowed. Surviving homestead structures show how central the hearth was to domestic life. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook. The chimney drew smoke upward, through simple but effective draft principles relying on rising hot air to pull fresh oxygen into the fire below. You crouch and feel the subtle current, a faint inward pull at the base of the hearth. You nudge a log with a poker. Sparks lift briefly and vanish. The wood hisses softly as pockets of sap heat and release. The smell is comforting and sharp at once, resin and smoke braided together. You add another split log, placing it carefully so air can circulate. Too tight and the flames will suffocate. Too loose and the heat will escape upward too quickly. Fire management was a learned skill on the frontier. It was not enough to light wood and hope for the best. Families passed down knowledge about how to stack logs, how to recognize seasoned timber by its sound and weight, how to keep a blaze steady without wasting fuel. Wood was labor. It had been chopped, hauled, stacked. Every piece mattered. You sit back on your heels and watch the new log catch. First a thin curl of smoke, then a lick of flame, then a stronger glow as heat spreads along the grain. The room responds almost immediately. The air shifts from brittle to merely cold. The change is subtle yet unmistakable. Some cabins featured small iron stoves instead of open fireplaces, especially later in the 19th century as railroads expanded and cast iron goods became more accessible. Those stoves radiated heat more evenly and used less fuel. Trade catalogues from the 1870s list compact heating stoves marketed specifically to homesteaders. You imagine the steady warmth such a stove would give, less smoky, more contained. There is a lesser-known detail about frontier fireplaces. In certain regions, settlers lined the back wall of the hearth with reflective metal sheets to bounce more heat into the room. It was an early attempt at efficiency, a small innovation born of necessity. You picture the faint shimmer of metal catching firelight, redirecting warmth outward, rather than letting it vanish up the chimney. You extend your hands toward the flames. The heat prickles at your fingertips, first gentle, then almost intense. You turn your palms, then the backs of your hands, warming them evenly. The sensation borders on bliss after time spent in freezing air. Skin that had tightened and numbed begins to soften again, suggests that a single cabin might burn 150 cords of timber, suggests that a single cabin might burn several cords of wood over the season. Others argue that those figures overlook creative conservation methods and alternative fuels. Standing before your modest blaze, you understand why the question persists. Consumption depended on countless variables: climate, family size, building quality. You adjust the damper, slightly controlling the airflow. Too much draft and flames roar wastefully. Too little and smoke seeps into the room. Smoke is more than an inconvenience. It irritates lungs and eyes, especially in tightly sealed spaces. You recall reading that chronic smoke exposure contributed to respiratory problems among frontier women and children who spent long hours near indoor fires. It is a reminder that even life-saving heat carried trade-offs. The fire settles into a steady rhythm. Flames no longer leap wildly. Instead, they move with calm assurance, curling around the log in glowing ribbons. You place a kettle near the edge, allowing water to warm slowly. Heated water served many purposes. It could be poured into metal pans to radiate gentle warmth or used to thaw stiff fingers. There is something meditative about tending fire, the repetitive motions, the attentive watching. You feed it not too much, not too little. It responds honestly. Neglect it and it fades. Overfeed it and it consumes your resources recklessly. Outside the wind continues its low murmur. Inside the hearth anchors the room. Its light softens the hard angles of the cabin, painting them in amber tones. You feel less like a guest in a hostile landscape and more like a participant shaping your environment. In a few hours, you will need to decide how to preserve this heat through the longer stretch of darkness. Letting the fire burn unchecked is not an option. Fuel must last until morning. You glance at the small stack of split logs nearby and calculate silently. For now, though, you sit close enough to feel warmth radiate through your layers. Your boots placed near but not too near the flames begin to dry and soften. A faint curl of steam rises from damp leather. The hearth is more than architecture. It is a partnership. You supply wood skill and vigilance. It supplies heat and light. On frozen nights in the Old West, that partnership often determined whether morning would arrive with comfort or with frost lining the inside of your walls. You rise slowly, satisfied with the fire's steady glow. The room feels marginally kinder now. Not warm by modern standards perhaps, but livable. You carry that fragile warmth back toward your bed, aware that through the night you will return again and again to this glowing heart of the cabin. The flames have settled into a steady, confident glow, but you already know they cannot be allowed to burn freely until dawn. Wood stacked beside the hearth is finite. The night ahead is long. Survival now depends on restraint rather than intensity. You crouch again before the fire and study it carefully. The logs are well caught, their edges rimmed in bright orange. Beneath them, a bed of coals pulses with deep red light. This is the moment to think ahead. If you simply let the blaze continue unchecked, it will consume itself within hours, leaving only ash and a bitterly cold room before sunrise. So you begin the quiet ritual of banking the fire. You use the poker to shift the larger logs closer together, reducing the space between them. Air feeds flame. Limiting that air slows the burn. You draw some of the glowing coals inward, concentrating heat at the center. Then with deliberate movements you scoop a thin layer of ash over parts of the embers. Not enough to smother them completely, just enough to dim their brightness and slow their appetite. This technique was widely practiced in the frontier homes and military forts alike. Manuals from the 19th century often advised householders to cover coals with ash at night to preserve heat until morning. It was a simple but effective method. Ash acts as a blanket, insulating the embers so they do not burn too quickly, while still retaining enough heat to rekindle with a few breaths of air at dawn. You pause and watch. The flame shrinks slightly, settling into a lower, more deliberate glow. The cabin grows dimmer. Shadows deepen in the corners. The scent of smoke softens as the fire quiets. There is something almost tender about this process. You are not extinguishing the fire. You are persuading it to rest. You sit back on your heels and listen. The crackling that once filled the room has faded to a faint whisper. Outside, the wind continues its steady passage along the cabin walls, but inside the hearth radiates a subdued warmth. It's not dramatic. It is steady. Some frontier families develop their own variations of this practice. A few accounts describe placing a heavy green log atop the banked coals, allowing it to smoulder slowly through the night. The moisture within the wood slowed combustion, further stretching precious fuel. It must have taken experience to judge how damp a log could be before it simply smoked out the room. There is also a curious note from one settler's journal claiming that a well-banked fire could survive even if snow drifted down the chimney during a storm. Whether that was the exaggeration or genuine observation is uncertain, but it speaks to the confidence people placed in this nightly routine. Historians continue to examine how much of frontier domestic knowledge was borrowed from earlier European practices and how much evolved in response to uniquely American climates. Banking coals was not new yet. The intensity of plains winters gave the technique renewed importance. In regions where temperatures plummeted far below zero, waking to a dead hearth, could mean beginning the day with frozen fingers and stiffened joints. You extend your hands toward the dimmer glow and feel its quieter heat. It does not bite like an open flame. Instead, it seeps outward steady and restrained. That's exactly what you need. You rise and cross the cabin, once more checking for drafts. A quilt hung over the door shifts slightly as wind presses from outside. You adjust it, tucking the edges tighter. You run your hand along the window frame, feeling for any sharp current of air. There is a faint chill near one corner. You stuff a scrap of cloth into the gap. Preparation does not end with the hearth. It extends to every seam and joint. Frozen nights reward thoroughness. Arrives, you will only need to clear away. Arrives, you will only need to clear away ash, stir the embers, and feed them gently. If the banking has been done well, a living glow will remain beneath the grey surface, waiting for breath and air. The room has grown noticeably darker now. The light is no longer lively, but subdued, almost contemplative. You can see your breath faintly in the air, though it does not hang as thickly as before. The warmth from the hearth spreads outward in a slow circle, touching floorboards, and the edge of your bed. There is a discipline to this restraint. It would feel comforting to let the flames leap high to flood the room with bright heat, but that comfort would be short-lived. Instead, you choose endurance. Some settlers reportedly tested their banking by placing a small iron tool within the coals and checking its warmth before bed. If the metal retained steady heat, they felt reassured the embers would last. It was a quiet measure of confidence, a small ritual before sleep. You sit for a moment longer, absorbing the hush. The cabin seems to exhale. Without the roar of flame, other sounds return. The soft creak of wood adjusting to cold, the distant howl of wind sliding over open land. The faint settling of your bedding as it cools slightly. Satisfied, you rise and step back toward your bed. The floor is cold beneath your stockings, but not as unforgiving as before. The banked fire continues, its patient glow behind you, a quiet heart beating within the cabin. You slip beneath the layers once more, drawing the buffalo robe up around your shoulders. The room is dim, lit only by the low red shimmer from the hearth. It casts a gentle halo across the ceiling, faint but reassuring. You lie still and listen to the steady presence of those embers. They are not dramatic, they do not demand attention, they simply endure. On frozen nights in the Old West, endurance was often the difference between waking comfortably and waking to ice rhyming your blankets. You have chosen patience over spectacle. You have trusted ash and careful placement to carry you through the darkest stretch. Outside, the prairie remains vast and merciless. Inside, beneath quilts and fur beside a banked hearth, you drift closer to sleep, confident that a small glowing promise waits beneath the ash until morning. You settle back into bed, the dim glow from the hearth pulsing gently against the far wall. The cabin feels smaller now, more intimate. The vast prairie has been reduced to a low hum beyond timber and sod. Inside this contained space, survival takes on a different texture. It is no longer about walls and fire alone. It is about the warmth generated by living bodies. You are not alone in this room. Perhaps a partner lies beside you, or a child tucked between adults, or a sibling pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath shared blankets. On the frontier, privacy was often a luxury postponed for milder seasons. During deep winter, closeness became practical. Census records and homestead accounts from the 19th century reveal that many families lived in 1 or 2 room dwellings, especially in early settlement years. That arrangement meant that sleeping quarters were communal by necessity. Beds were shared not merely for companionship but for heat conservation. 2 or 3 bodies beneath heavy covers could raise the temperature of that small space significantly. You feel it now. The gentle warmth radiating from another person seeps through layers of wool and fur. There is a rhythm to shared sleep, the slow rise and fall of breathing, the occasional shift of weight, even the faint murmur of a dreamer turning over. These subtle movements remind you that you are not facing the night alone. You slide closer, instinctively narrowing any gap where cold air might settle. Your shoulder brushes against another and the contact is reassuring. Heat pools between you. It is not dramatic, but it is steady. Human bodies are remarkable furnaces when properly insulated. In some frontier households, children were arranged strategically in beds during the harshest weather. The youngest often slept in the center, shielded on either side by adults or older siblings. It was a quiet choreography repeated nightly, protection woven into routine. There is also an unexpected tenderness in this closeness. The frontier is often portrayed as rugged and stoic, yet diaries sometimes hint at softer realities. One entry from a plain settler describes the comfort of listening to her children breathe on a wind-lashed night, finding courage in their nearness. It is a reminder that endurance was emotional as well as physical. A curious custom occasionally mentioned in oral histories suggests that some families believed counting the breaths of those beside you could calm anxious thoughts during storms. Whether it truly reduced fear or simply provided a mental focus is difficult to determine, but the practice appears more than once in recollections. You imagine quietly matching your breathing to another's, letting the rhythm steady your own heartbeat. There is an ongoing conversation among researchers about how much these cramped conditions shaped family dynamics. Some argue that constant proximity strengthened bonds through shared hardship. Others suggest it may have heightened tensions in already stressful environments. As you lie here aware of the limited space, yet grateful for the warmth it creates, you sense that both outcomes were likely possible. The cabin creaks softly as the temperature outside continues to drop. Frost feathers along the inside edges of the window pane, delicate patterns forming in silence. You pull the blanket higher, tucking it beneath your chin and around the shoulders of the person beside you. The shared bed holds heat in layers. Beneath you straw or feather, filling traps air. Around you wool and fur slow the escape of warmth. Between you living bodies generate more of it. The effect is cumulative. Each layer contributes. Each presence matters. There is also a practical awareness that movement should be minimal. Tossing and turning lets in cold drafts. Frontier sleepers learned to remain relatively still once settled, conserving the pocket of heat they had built. It required discipline, especially for children restless with dreams. In especially severe weather, some households reportedly brought smaller livestock into adjoining spaces to share warmth. Chickens might be kept near the hearth or a calf sheltered in a leander connected to the cabin. While it may sound unusual to modern ears, animals gave off measurable heat, and their presence could raise the ambient temperature slightly. The scent might not have been pleasant, but the trade-off was survival. You become aware of your own breathing slower now. The banked fire offers a low red glow that pulses faintly against the far wall. Combined with the warmth of those beside you, the room feels manageable. Not cozy in the modern sense, but bearable. Outside wind continues to comb across the prairie. Snow shifts against the cabin's base with a soft scraping sound. Yet here, in this compressed space, there is a fragile sanctuary. You recall that earlier image of standing alone beneath a sky crowded with stars. The cold felt overwhelming then. Now pressed gently against another sleeping form, the same night feels less absolute. Human closeness narrows the scale of the world. Some accounts from frontier forts describe soldiers bunking tightly in shared quarters during winter campaigns. Their combined body heat often made the difference between tolerable cold and genuine danger. It is a practical truth repeated across many cultures in harsh climates. Shared warmth is efficient warmth. You're just slightly careful not to break the seal of blankets around your shoulders. A hand brushes yours briefly before settling again. The contact is fleeting but grounding. The night stretches on. The embers in the hearth glow quietly. Frost creeps across the window in intricate patterns, and within this modest cabin, you and those beside you create a small island of heat through nothing more complex than proximity. On frozen nights in the Old West, survival was rarely solitary. It was communal, layered, and often as simple as lying close enough to share breath and warmth until dawn arrived. Sometime in the deeper stretch of night you wake briefly. The fire remains banked, glowing low and steady. The warmth inside the cabin holds, but you sense the cold pressing harder against the outer walls. The wind has shifted. It now drives snow against one side of the house in soft, persistent waves. By morning you will see the drift piled high against the logs or sod blocks, And strangely, that drift will not be entirely unwelcome. You rise quietly, easing yourself from beneath the shared covers so as not to let too much warmth escape. The floor is cool but manageable. You cross to the small window and peer through a thin crescent of clear glass not yet claimed by frost. Snow swirls in the moonlight, carried sideways by the wind. It collects along the base of the cabin, forming a thick ridge. To modern instinct, snow feels like an enemy. It buries paths, blocks doors, hides landmarks. Yet on the frontier, snow could also serve as insulation. Packed tightly against walls, it reduced the flow of air beneath logs and through gaps. In effect, it added another layer to the structure. Weather journals kept at Western military outposts in the 19th century document how snowdrift sometimes protected buildings by sealing cracks near the foundation. Officers noted that cabins often felt less drafty after heavy snowfall. The principle is simple. Snow contains trapped air. When compacted, it slows heat transfer surprisingly well. You open the door, briefly bracing against the cold rush. The wind bites instantly at your face. You step outside just long enough to examine the drift along the wall. The snow has already formed a curved barrier nearly reaching the window ledge on the windward side. You take a shovel and gently pack the drift tighter against the cabin's base. The motion is steady and deliberate. Scoop, press, smooth. The snow compresses into a denser mass, less likely to shift with the next gust. Your breath clouds heavily in front of you. The air smells clean and sharp, carrying a faint hint of distant pine. It may seem counterintuitive to pile frozen material against your home in freezing weather, yet the logic holds. Much like sod snow becomes a protective shell when shaped properly. Arctic cultures have known this for centuries, constructing entire shelters from compacted snow blocks. While frontier settlers rarely built full snow houses, they understood its insulating potential. There is a curious anecdote from a Dakota homesteader who once wrote that after a fierce blizzard, her family joked they had gained a new winter coat for their house. Whether meant lightly or seriously, the image captures the idea. The land itself offers materials for defense if you are willing to see them differently. Researchers continue to explore how much frontier settlers adopted winter survival techniques from indigenous neighbours. Some evidence suggests practical knowledge was exchanged informally, particularly regarding clothing and shelter adaptations. Other interpretations propose that settlers independently rediscovered certain methods through necessity. As you press snow firmly into place, the origin of the idea feels less important than its effect. You step back and examine your work. The lower half of the cabin wall is now encased in a thick white buffer. It softens the wind's impact, reducing the sharp whistle that once slipped beneath the logs. Already you sense the difference. The interior will hold warmth a little longer. You return inside, quickly shutting the door against the gusts. The contrast is immediate. Though still cool, the cabin feels sheltered. You brush snow from your shoulders and move back toward the hearth. Inside, the banked embers glow faithfully. You stir them gently, not to wake them fully, but to ensure they remain alive beneath their ash covering. A faint shimmer answers your touch. Snow continues to accumulate outside, building gentle curves along the roof's edge. In heavy storms that weight could become dangerous. Roofs collapsed under excessive accumulation if not cleared. Yet moderate drifts served a purpose, creating natural windbreaks. The light through the window shifts as clouds move across the moon. The room takes on a softer hue filtered through layers of frost and snow. There is a hush to this kind of night. The wind, though persistent, sounds muffled, as if the world has wrapped itself in cotton. You sit for a moment on the edge of the bed, feeling the lingering warmth beneath blankets. The people beside you sleep on, unaware of your brief excursion. Their breathing remains steady. The prairie outside may be relentless, but it also provides tools. Wood for fuel, sod for walls, snow for insulation. Survival depends on recognizing these resources rather than resisting them outright. A lesser-known detail from frontier memoirs mentions families intentionally leaving small snowbanks near doors during winter to block low drafts. They would carve narrow passages through the drifts rather than clearing them entirely. It was a subtle compromise between access and protection. You glance once more toward the window. Frost patterns have grown more intricate, spreading like delicate ferns across the glass. The packed snow at the base of the wall stands firm. Returning to bed, you slide carefully beneath the covers, mindful not to disturb the pocket of shared warmth. The buffalo robe settles around you again, heavy and reassuring. Outside, snow continues to gather layer upon layer. Inside, the cabin benefits from its quiet accumulation. What seemed like an adversary becomes a shield. On frozen nights in the Old West, the line between threat and protection was often thin. Snow could trap you or guard you. It could isolate a homestead or insulate it. Much depended on how you shaped it, how you worked with it, rather than against it. You close your eyes once more, listening to the softened wind and the faint pulse of embers in the hearth. Beyond the walls, the storm builds your winter armor one drift at a time. The storm does not rage all night, but it never fully rests either. You drift in and out of sleep, aware of the steady hush of snow against wood, the faint tapping of ice crystals against the window. At some point, a hand touches your shoulder gently. It is your turn. On the frontier, especially during severe cold, many households kept a loose rotation through the darkest hours. Someone would wake periodically to check the fire, listen for shifting wind, or ensure that animals outside were not in distress. This was not paranoia. It was habit shaped by experience. You ease yourself upright, careful not to let too much warmth escape the bedding. The room is dim lit only by the deep red glow from the hearth. The embers have held well, though their brightness has faded slightly. You feel a small flicker of satisfaction. The banking worked. You cross the floor slowly, the boards cool beneath your feet. The cabin feels different at this hour. Quieter. The shared breathing behind you blends into a soft chorus. Outside, the wind sounds less aggressive, now more like a steady exhale. You kneel by the hearth and stir the coals gently. A faint flare answers, revealing a healthy core of heat beneath the ash. You add a modest split log, not enough to ignite a roaring blaze, just enough to sustain warmth until the next watch. The wood catches slowly, flames licking upward in thin ribbons. Night watches were common not only in homesteads but also in frontier forts and wagon camps. Military records from Western Post describe soldiers assigned rotating fire duty during winter campaigns. A dying fire could mean frozen water barrels, stiffened boots, or worse. The practice of shared vigilance extended beyond domestic spaces. You rise and move toward the door, pressing your ear lightly against it. The wind has shifted again, but the packed snow you built earlier remains firm. There is no sharp whistle at the base of the wall. That quiet is reassuring. You open the door a crack, just enough to peer into the night. The air is painfully cold, sharper than before. The sky has cleared, revealing a spread of stars so bright they seem almost close enough to touch. Snow lies in smooth, sculpted drifts across the yard, glowing faintly under starlight. You step outside, briefly pulling your coat tighter. The cold seizes your breath instantly. The world feels suspended, as if even sound has frozen in place. In the distance, you hear a low animal call, perhaps a cow shifting in a shelter or a horse stamping its hooves. Livestock required attention on such nights. Ranch journals from the late 19th century recount how cattle were sometimes checked repeatedly during extreme cold snaps to prevent frostbite or suffocation in snowdrifts. A rancher might walk the perimeter of a corral several times before dawn lantern in hand, scanning for trouble. You scan your own small yard. The animals appear quiet, their forms dark against the snow. Steam rises faintly from their bodies. Satisfied, you retreat inside, quickly closing the door against the biting air. Back by the hearth, you warm your hands once more. The small addition of wood has brightened the room slightly. Shadows stretch and shrink along the walls. The cabin feels alive, sustained by your brief attention. There is an odd stillness to this hour. It sits somewhere between night and morning, suspended and delicate. You can sense the long arc of darkness behind you and the promise of dawn ahead, though it remains unseen. A lesser-known practice in some frontier communities involved hanging small bells, near livestock shelters during winter storms. The idea was that if wind shifted and structures strained under snow, the bells might ring faintly alerting the household. Whether widely adopted or not is uncertain, but the notion reveals how attentively people listen to their surroundings. Ongoing discussion among historians considers how these nightly routines shape the psychological resilience of frontier families. Did constant vigilance breed anxiety, or did it create a sense of agency in an unpredictable environment? As you sit beside the glowing hearth, you feel less anxious and more purposeful. There is comfort in having something to do. You check the window once more. Frost patterns have thickened, nearly sealing the glass entirely. The packed snow outside gleams faintly in the starlight. Behind you, someone shifts under the blankets, perhaps sensing the brief increase in warmth. You smile faintly, though no one sees it. The fire crackles, softly steady and controlled. Your watch will last perhaps an hour, then you will wake another to take your place. The cycle continues until first light creeps over the horizon. You sit on a low stool and let your gaze rest on the embers. They pulse in slow rhythm, red and gold beneath their ash covering. You think about how easily this entire scene could unravel with neglect. A missed turn at the hearth, a forgotten draught, a door left slightly ajar. Frozen nights on the old West frontier demanded attention. Not dramatic heroics, but quiet, repeated acts of care. You rise once more to ensure the added log has settled into a steady burn. It has. Satisfied, you move back toward the bed and gently touch the shoulder of the next watchkeeper. As you slide beneath the blankets again, the warmth feels richer for having stepped briefly into the cold. Shared vigilance has carried you one step closer to morning. Outside the prairie rests beneath starlight and snow. Inside, watchful hands keep the fragile balance between frost and fire intact. When the next watch wakes you again, it is not for the fire this time. It is for the animals. A low, uneasy sound drifts through the wall, barely audible over the wind. It is not loud enough to alarm, but it is different. You recognize it immediately. Livestock shift and call in certain ways when the cold bites too deeply. You pull on your boots, now softened by their time near the hearth, and shrug into your coat. Their cabin door opens with a muted scrape against packed snow. The cold outside feels sharper than before, the kind that tightens the skin across your cheeks and turns breath into thick white plumes. Animals were not optional companions on the frontier. They were essential capital. Agricultural census data from the late 19th century shows that cattle, horses and sheep often represented the majority of a family's wealth. Losing them to cold could mean losing everything. Winter storms were not just uncomfortable, they were financially devastating. You step into the yard lantern, held low to shield the flame from wind. Snow crunches beneath your boots in a brittle rhythm. The sky remains clear, stars blazing fiercely overhead. Cold air has a way of sharpening light, making each star appear etched against the darkness. The animals cluster near a simple windbreak constructed of boards and stacked hay bales. Their bodies form a rough circle, hind quarters turned toward the wind. Steam rises from their backs, curling upward before dissolving into the night. You move closer, speaking softly. Your voice sounds small in the open air. A horse lifts its head, nostrils flaring, then settles again as it recognizes you. You run a gloved hand along its neck. The hair feels stiff with frost, but warm beneath. In especially harsh winters, ranchers sometimes drove cattle into coulees or natural depressions to shield them from wind. Accounts from the winter of 1886 and 1887, often remembered for catastrophic livestock losses, describe herds caught in open blizzards without sufficient shelter. That season reshaped ranching practices across the plains, encouraging fenced pastures and stored feed rather than reliance on open range alone. You check the hay, breaking apart any crust that has frozen along its surface. Animals require more calories in cold weather just as humans do. You scatter additional feed watching as heads lower and chewing begins again. There is a quiet companionship in this moment. The animals depend on you, and in turn your survival depends on them. Horses carry you across distance. Cattle provide meat and income. Sheep offer wool that might line your own blankets. A curious belief circulated in some rural communities that certain animals sensed severe storms before humans could. Farmers would claim that horses grew restless hours before a blizzard struck. While modern meteorology offers explanations involving pressure changes, the impression that animals possess special foresight lingered in folklore. You glance at the horse again, wondering if it sensed something you did not. Researchers continued to explore how frontier ranchers adapted their methods after repeated winter losses. Some evidence suggests that those who diversified livestock or invested in sturdier barns fared better long-term. Others emphasize that sheer luck often played a role depending on the path of a storm or the timing of a cold snap. You circle the small enclosure slowly, lantern-like, casting long shadows across snow. The animals appear stable for now. Their breath rises in steady plumes. Hooves shift, occasionally breaking thin ice along the ground. Satisfied, you turn back toward the cabin. The structure looks modest against the wide sky, a dark silhouette rimmed with frost. Smoke curls faintly from the chimney, proof that the hearth remains alive within. Before stepping inside, you pause for a moment. The cold presses against your coat and seeps through seams. Your eyelashes gather a thin crust of frost, yet there is something profoundly clear about this air. It carries no humidity, no softness, only sharp definition. You re-enter the cabin, quickly closing the door with care. The contrast is immediate. The air inside, though cool, feels gentle compared to the bite outside. The faint scent of wood smoke wraps around you. You set the lantern aside and warm your hands near the hearth. The embers glow steadily, reflecting in your tired eyes. You think about how thin the margin can be between stability and loss on these nights. In some homesteads, families reportedly brought newborn livestock into attached sheds or even into the cabin itself during extreme cold. The arrangement was far from elegant, yet it ensured survival. The boundary between domestic space and barn blurred when temperatures plunged. You remove your boots and brush away clinging snow. Beneath your layers, your skin tingles as warmth returns. The bed beckons once more, layered and inviting. As you slip back beneath the covers, the warmth feels earned. The animals outside have been checked. The fire is steady. The snow remains packed against the walls. Frozen nights in the Old West demanded attention, not only to human comfort, but to the creatures that sustained frontier life. In tending them, you safeguard your own future. Outside, the herd settles into quiet breathing. Inside, the hearth pulses gently. You close your eyes, knowing that vigilance has carried you one step closer to dawn. When you finally drift back into sleep, it is lighter than before. Your body remains aware of the cold beyond the walls, even as warmth gathers beneath wool and fur. At some point before dawn, you wake again, not from sound this time, but from sensation. A faint chill creeps along your wrist where the blanket has shifted. You tug it back into place and become suddenly aware of how carefully you're dressed even in bed. Layering was not simply daytime practice on the frontier, it extended into the night. Surviving letters and store ledgers from western settlements show steady purchases of wool undergarments, knitted caps and thick stockings intended specifically for winter wear. Clothing functioned as portable shelter, something you carried with you, even beneath blankets. You flex your fingers inside woolen mitts that you chose to keep on while sleeping. The fabric feels slightly rough against your skin, yet comforting. Wool traps tiny pockets of air within its fibers, slowing the escape of body heat. It is a humble technology older than the frontier itself, yet perfectly suited to these conditions. You shift slightly and feel the weight of layered garments against your legs. Long johns beneath heavier trousers, sometimes even left partially on overnight during the harshest cold. Removing every layer before bed was a luxury reserved for milder climates. There is an art to layering properly. Too tight and circulation suffers, making extremities colder. Too loose and air gaps invite drafts. Frontier families learned through experience which combinations worked best. The knowledge was practical and often passed quietly from parent to child. In regions farther north and west, settlers sometimes incorporated elements of indigenous clothing into their winter wardrobes. Fur-lined moccasins, mittens with extended cuffs and layered hide garments provided superior insulation in certain conditions. Trade records from frontier posts indicate a steady exchange of such items alongside metal, tools, and textiles. Adaptation was not ideological, it was necessary. A small but intriguing detail appears in some household accounts, describing the use of newspaper stuffed between shirt layers as extra insulation. Paper surprisingly can trap air effectively when layered. While not elegant, it served as a temporary barrier against wind when better materials were scarce. You slide a hand beneath the blanket and feel the warmth pulled around your torso. Your head remains covered by a knit cap pulled low over your ears. Heat escapes quickly from exposed skin, and the head is no exception. Practical experience taught settlers that uncovered ears could numb and sting painfully before morning. Medical texts from the late 19th century warned of frostbite even indoors during severe cold snaps, particularly in poorly insulated dwellings. Extremities such as fingers or toes, ears and noses were most vulnerable. Though the cabin shields you from the worst of the wind, it cannot eliminate the risk entirely. You recall a story told by a traveller who claimed to have slept with his boots on during a particularly brutal winter night in a mountain pass. Whether that account was embellished for dramatic effect is difficult to know, but it reflects a common instinct. Keep as much protection on as possible when warmth is uncertain. There is also a persistent rumour in some frontier anecdotes that rubbing snow on frostbitten skin was considered helpful. Modern understanding shows that rapid rewarming with care is more effective, yet the belief circulated widely at the time. In isolated conditions, knowledge often blended observation with trial and error. Ongoing historical analysis explores how clothing production shaped frontier economies. Wool mills in eastern states supplied garments that travelled west by rail, while local sheep raising provided raw material in some territories. The garments you wear represent not only personal comfort, but a larger web of trade and labour. You adjust your stockings slightly, ensuring there are no tight creases at the ankle. Even small pressure points can reduce blood flow, leading to colder toes by morning. Attention to such details becomes second nature after enough frozen nights. Outside the wind has quieted further. Snow lies still. Inside the air holds steady at a tolerable chill. The banked fire continues its slow, patient glow, offering a subtle buffer against the temperature beyond the walls. You tuck your hands beneath your arms, briefly sharing warmth within your own body. The simple act feels grounding. You are both shelter and sheltered. There is a quiet resilience in these layers. Fabric and fur working in partnership with fire and walls. No single element guarantees comfort. Together they create a fragile equilibrium. As your breathing slows once more, you become aware of the gentle weight of blankets pressing downward, sealing and heat. Beneath them, your layered clothing forms a second barrier. Between the two, your body maintains its narrow margin of warmth. Frozen nights in the Old West demanded preparation that extended to the smallest details. A cap pulled snug, mittens left on, extra cloth tucked at the ankles. These choices may seem modest, yet they carried you safely through hours when the temperature outside could freeze exposed skin in minutes. You close your eyes again, reassured by the quiet strength of wool and fur wrapped around you. The prairie beyond the cabin may be vast and indifferent, but within your layered cocoon, warmth holds steady until the first faint hint of dawn begins to soften the horizon. Just before dawn, the cold feels sharpest. There is something about that final stretch of night when the embers burn lowest and the air outside reaches its deepest chill. You wake to a tingling in your fingertips, a faint numbness that was not there an hour ago. The cabin has grown quieter still, as if even the wind has retreated to conserve strength. You flex your fingers slowly beneath the blanket. Pins and needles ripple through them, uncomfortable but reassuring. Sensation means circulation. You bring your hands close to your chest, letting your own warmth coax life back into the tips. Frostbite was a genuine danger on the frontier, not only for travellers caught outdoors, but for those inside poorly insulated homes. Army medical reports from Western posts in the late 19th century describe cases of frozen ears, fingers and toes during severe cold waves. Even brief exposure to sub-zero air could damage skin if protection failed. You sit up carefully and swing your legs over the side of the bed. The air bites at your nose immediately. It feels almost metallic as you inhale. You rise and move toward the hearth to assess the embers. They have dimmed, but not dimmed or died. A deep red core remains beneath the ash. You kneel and stir them gently, exposing fresh glow. A faint flare answers and relief follows. You add a small piece of kindling and blow softly until a thin flame curls upward. Behind you, someone shifts and murmurs. You glance back, noticing a child's hand resting outside the blanket. The fingers look pale in the dim light. You move quietly to tuck the covering back around them, rubbing the hand gently between your palms before returning it to warmth. Frontier families developed their own remedies for cold, stiffened skin. One common approach was gradual warming near a fire, avoiding sudden heat that might shock frozen tissue. Instructions printed in some 19th century almanacs advised gentle friction and slow rewarming, rather than plunging numbed extremities into hot water. There were also less reliable cures. A few rural communities believed that applying goose fat to frost-nipped skin could restore circulation more quickly. While animal fats did create a temporary barrier against further heat loss, their effectiveness as treatment remains uncertain. The practice likely arose from observation and hope combined. You extend your hands toward the newly awakened flame. Heat reaches your fingers in waves. The sensation stings briefly as blood flow increases, then settles into warmth. The cabin responds slowly to the revived fire, its chill easing inch by inch. Medical understanding of frostbite during the Old West era was limited compared to modern knowledge. Yet practical experience taught people to recognize warning signs. Pale or waxy skin, numbness followed by aching pain, in severe cases blistering after thawing. Though frontier life is often portrayed as endlessly hardy, such injuries were feared and respected. You glance toward the window. The frost on the glass has thickened into intricate crystalline patterns, delicate and silent. Outside, the sky has begun to lighten faintly along the horizon, a thin grey line, separating land from night. The coldest hour often arrives just before sunrise. Meteorological studies confirm this pattern even today. With no incoming solar radiation through the night, heat continues to radiate from the Earth into the atmosphere until dawn interrupts the cycle. On the plains, that effect could push temperatures to their lowest point just before first light. You stand and move about the cabin, briefly encouraging circulation. A few gentle steps, a roll of shoulders. You do not want to break the precious warmth entirely, but a small amount of movement helps. Would be reheated before sleep and wrapped in blankets. The stones would be reheated before sleep and wrapped in blankets. The stones would be reheated before sleep and wrapped carefully in cloth. The technique required caution, as too much heat could scorch fabric or skin, yet when managed well it provided steady warmth for hours. There is an ongoing discussion among historians about how frequently frostbite led to permanent disability among settlers. Some sources suggest that minor injuries were common, but rarely documented formally, while severe cases may have been underreported in isolated regions. The truth likely varies from settlement to settlement. You return to the hearth and add another modest log. Flames rise a little stronger now, casting more confident light across the cabin interior. The room begins to feel less brittle. Behind you, the household stirs gradually. A cough, a stretch, the faint rustle of straw within mattresses. Dawn is near. You glance at your own hands again. Colour has returned fully. You flex your fingers once more and feel strength in them. The brief chill has passed. Frozen nights tested more than walls and fuel. They tested attention to small signs. A pale fingertip, a draft at the ankle, a shift in the fire's glow. Survival often depended on noticing these details early. The horizon brightens, slowly turning from grey to pale silver. Outside, snow reflects the first hint of light. Inside, the hearth now burns with quiet assurance. You draw a long breath and feel the cabin warming steadily. Another night has been navigated, not without vigilance, not without discomfort, but without injury. As daylight begins to filter through the frosted window, you understand how easily numbness could have been ignored. How tempting it would have been to remain still beneath blankets and hope for warmth to return on its own. Instead you rose, you stirred the embers, you warmed small hands, you paid attention. On frozen nights in the Old West, attention was often the thin line between a temporary chill and lasting harm, and with dawn finally approaching, that thin line is held. Morning arrives slowly, spilling pale light across the snowbound prairie. The storm has passed, leaving a silence so complete it almost hums. You stand near the window and watch the horizon glow faint pink frost still tracing delicate patterns along the glass. The cabin has held through the night. The fire, carefully tended, now burns brighter as you feed it fresh wood. The room warms, gradually releasing the stiffness from your shoulders. Yet as you sip from a tin cup of heated water, you think about something deeper than firewood and wool. Long before settlers arrived on these plains, indigenous nations survived winters that were often harsher and longer than what you experienced last night. Archaeological findings and oral histories show that tribes such as the Lakota Cheyenne and Blackfoot developed sophisticated seasonal strategies to endure sub-zero temperatures. Mobility shelter design clothing and communal structure all played roles. You imagine stepping into a winter teepee constructed of buffalo hides, carefully stitched and angled to manage airflow. The conical design allowed smoke to escape while retaining warmth. Contrary to the stereotype of flimsy tents, winter tippers were engineered with remarkable efficiency. When positioned correctly, they could withstand strong winds sweeping across open land. You walk outside now, crunching across fresh snow. The world feels newly sculpted, as if carved overnight from white stone. Breath rises from your mouth in soft plumes. The cold remains sharp, but sunlight has begun to soften its edge. Ethnographic studies from the 19th century describe how indigenous communities adjusted camp locations seasonally, often moving to river valleys or wooded areas that provided natural windbreaks. Rather than fighting the landscape directly, they shifted within it. This adaptability stands in contrast to some early settler practices that attempted to impose fixed structures regardless of terrain. There is also the matter of clothing. Fur-lined garments, layered hides, and insulated moccasins provided flexibility and warmth suited to extreme cold. Accounts from traders frequently mention the superior warmth of such attire compared to standard wool coats brought from the East. Adaptation was visible in what you wore. A lesser-known tradition among certain plains groups involved placing heated stones inside hide pouches to warm sleeping areas. Similar to the stone warming techniques you used in your cabin, this method reflects parallel solutions emerging from shared environmental challenges. Modern historians continue to examine how knowledge exchange occurred between settlers and indigenous peoples. Some argue that practical winter survival techniques were adopted more frequently than popular narratives acknowledge. Others suggest that cultural barriers limited widespread borrowing despite clear advantages. Standing in the quiet snow, you sense that survival often overrides pride. You crouch and scoop a handful of powdery snow. It sparkles in the morning light, almost blindingly bright. The cold bites at your bare fingers before you quickly slip your glove back on. In many indigenous communities, winter was not merely endured, but integrated into cultural rhythms. Storytelling traditions often flourished during colder months when travel slowed and families gathered within shelters. Snow outside created a boundary focusing attention inward. You consider how different your own night might have been without borrowed techniques. Banking coals, insulating walls with snow layering strategically. Even if learned indirectly, these practices echo methods refined long before cabins dotted the prairie. A curious detail preserved in some oral histories tells of children learning to read subtle signs in snowdrifts to predict wind changes. The shape and texture of accumulating snow could indicate shifting patterns before the sky itself revealed clues. Such attentiveness to environment becomes second nature when survival depends on it. Ongoing academic discussions explore whether frontier mythology has minimized indigenous contributions to winter survival narratives. The image of solitary settlers braving the cold often dominates popular imagination, yet collaborative knowledge and observation shape many outcomes. You stand upright again, looking across the bright expanse. Smoke rises from your chimney in a thin grey column dissolving into clear air. The cabin appears sturdy against the backdrop of snow, yet you now recognise that survival here is layered with history older than its logs. Returning inside, you add another piece of wood to the hearth. The warmth spreads more confidently through the room. The others begin to stir, rubbing eyes and stretching limbs stiff from sleep. You feel gratitude not only for your own preparations, but for generations of adaptation embedded in this landscape. Frozen nights on the frontier were never faced entirely alone. They were navigated through observation exchange and steady learning. The prairie beyond your door remains vast and indifferent, but the strategies you employ carry echoes of deeper experience. Sunlight now glints across the snowfields, signalling the beginning of another day. And though the cold has not vanished, it feels less mysterious than it did before. By midday, the sun sits low but bright, casting a pale glow across the frozen prairie. The snow reflects so much light that you squint against it even as cold air continues to nip at your cheeks. Inside the cabin, warmth lingers near the hearth, yet you know that not all frontier homes look like this one. You imagine instead descending a few steps into the earth itself. On the open plains where timber was scarce and wind relentless, some settlers carved their homes directly into hillsides or dug partially below ground. These dwellings, often called dugouts, were practical responses to limited resources. Land records and early homestead descriptions confirm that many families initially lived in such earthen shelters before constructing more permanent structures. You step down into this imagined space now. The ceiling is low, supported by rough beams. The walls are packed soil, cool to the touch, yet surprisingly stable. The air feels different here, less exposed, less vulnerable to sudden gusts. Earth has remarkable insulating properties. Soil maintains a relatively constant temperature compared to open air. In winter, that means a dugout can remain warmer than a surface cabin when properly sealed. It is not luxurious, it is not grand, but it is efficient. You run your hand along the interior wall and feel faint moisture where condensation has gathered. Ventilation must be managed carefully in such spaces. Too little airflow and smoke lingers, too much and precious warmth escapes. Some early settlers described the initial shock of living beneath a roof that was partly made of dirt. Diaries occasionally mention roots protruding through ceilings or insects appearing unexpectedly during warmer spells. Yet during the coldest nights, those same walls offered steady protection. A lesser-known detail from frontier accounts reveals that some dugouts included small windows set high near ground level, allowing daylight to enter without sacrificing too much heat. These openings were often covered with cloth or oiled paper to reduce drafts. The light filtering through them would be soft and diffuse, casting a muted glow across earthen floors. There remains an ongoing discussion among architectural historians about whether dugouts were viewed primarily as temporary solutions or embraced as long-term dwellings in certain regions. Some evidence suggests that families upgraded to frame houses as soon as lumber became available. Other accounts indicate that a well-built dugout could serve comfortably for years. You picture yourself seated inside one on a frozen evening. A small stove radiates warmth into the compact space. The ceiling feels close overhead, creating a sense of enclosure that is almost comforting. Outside, wind sweeps across open land, but down here its voice is faint and distant. The smell inside would be distinct. Earth-faint smoke, perhaps the dry scent of stored grain. It is a grounded atmosphere literally rooted in the land. During the especially harsh winters, dugouts may have offered an advantage over poorly insulated surface cabins. With fewer exposed walls, less heat escaped into open air. Snow drifting above added another insulating layer. You step back outside into the bright afternoon and glance at your own cabin again. It stands upright, visible against the horizon. Dugouts, by contrast, blended into their surroundings. From a distance, they might appear as little more than subtle depressions in the ground. There is something humbling about that. Instead of asserting dominance over the landscape, the structure sinks into it. A curious anecdote appears in one settler's letter, describing how children sometimes use the sloped roof of a dugout as a winter sledding hill after fresh snowfall. What served as shelter by night became playground by day. Survival and play intertwined. Modern research into thermal efficiency has revisited these early designs with renewed interest. Earth-sheltered homes are sometimes promoted even today for their energy-conserving qualities. It is intriguing to think that necessity on the frontier anticipated concepts now praised in sustainable architecture. You imagine a frozen night settling over a dugout. The air outside plummets, snow accumulates silently. Inside the stove burns steadily and the earthen walls absorb and release warmth slowly. The temperature remains more stable than in a thin-walled cabin exposed on all sides. Yet dugouts carried risks as well. Heavy rain or rapid thaw could compromise walls. Structural collapse was a real concern if beams weakened. Living close to the earth demanded vigilance and maintenance. You kneel and brush a bit of snow aside, revealing the firm ground beneath. The prairie appears flat and endless, yet beneath your feet lies material capable of shielding life through winter. As afternoon light begins to fade, you step back inside your cabin, carrying with you the understanding that shelter on the frontier took many forms. Logs stacked against wind, sod blocks layered thick, earth carved into protective hollows. Each method represented adaptation to local conditions. Each reflected a careful reading of the available materials and climate realities. Frozen nights did not yield to bravado. They responded to thoughtful design and steady maintenance. Whether beneath timber beams or packed soil, survival hinged on shaping space to slow the relentless escape of warmth. The sun dips lower now, casting long blue shadows across snow. Inside the hearth waits to be fed again. Another evening approaches, and with it the familiar descent of temperature. You glance once more at the wide expanse beyond your door, then close it gently behind you, grateful for walls that stand firm against the coming cold. The afternoon fades quickly in winter, as if daylight itself prefers not to linger in the cold. You step outside once more before sunset, and notice how the air feels thinner here than it did on the open plains. You have moved westward in your imagination into higher country where mountains rise and valleys hold shadows long before evening truly arrives. High altitude brings its own kind of cold. In the Rocky Mountain territories during the 19th century, mining camps and small settlements often sat thousands of feet above sea level. Weather observations recorded at places like Leadville, Colorado show winter temperatures plunging well below zero, intensified by elevation and wind exposure. The cold here feels sharper, less forgiving, as if it cuts rather than settles. You stand at the edge of a narrow clearing surrounded by dark pine. Snow clings to branches in thick white layers. The scent of resin hangs faintly in the air, clean and almost sweet. When wind moves through the trees, it carries a low whisper rather than the broad sweep you heard on the plains. Cabins in mountain regions were often built from abundant timber, their logs thicker and more closely fitted than those in treeless areas. Stone chimneys rose sturdier, designed to withstand heavy snowfall, accumulating on roofs. You step inside one such cabin now and feel the immediate contrast between outside and in. The space is compact walls, darkened by years of smoke and resin. A cast iron stove stands at the centre, radiating steady heat. Unlike an open hearth, this stove contains flame more efficiently, sending warmth outward in a consistent circle. Mining records from Colorado and Montana indicate that iron stoves became increasingly common in mountain camps once railroads expanded access to manufactured goods. Their compact design and fuel efficiency made them valuable in remote high-altitude settlements where hauling firewood could be exhausting. You remove your gloves and hold your hands near the stove's surface. Heat radiates in waves, not as flickering light, but as solid warmth. The difference is noticeable. In mountain cold, efficient heating is not luxury, it is necessity. Outside, snow begins to fall again, softer this time. At higher elevation, storms can appear with little warning, driven by rapidly shifting weather patterns. Mountain residents learn to read subtle signs in the sky and wind, a sudden stillness in trees, a halo around the moon. These small indicators often preceded heavy snowfall. There is an intriguing detail in some mining camp recollections that men sometimes slept with their water buckets turned upside down near the stove. The belief was that this reduced the likelihood of the water freezing solid overnight. Whether scientifically sound or not, the practice appears more than once in letters home. Researchers continue to analyze how altitude influenced winter survival strategies compared to lower regions. Some argue that the intense cold demanded greater reliance on manufactured goods like stoves and metal tools. Others point out that isolation in mountain camps required similar ingenuity to that found on open prairie, albeit with different materials. You glance toward the door, noticing thick felt or wool strips tacked along its frame to block drafts. Windows are small and double-layered when possible. Every crack is sealed carefully. At this elevation, wind can push fine snow into the tiniest opening. The cabin feels almost cocoon-like. Outside, snow accumulates quietly, layering itself across rooftops and tree branches. Inside, the stove ticks faintly as metal expands and contracts with heat. Mountain communities often faced additional risks beyond simple cold. Avalanches pose serious threats in steep terrain. Newspapers from the late 19th century report entire cabins buried under sudden slides during heavy snow years. Shelter placement required careful consideration of slope and wind direction. You sit on a rough wooden bench and imagine night descending fully over this alpine settlement. The stars would appear closer, sharper, almost brittle in the thin air. The cold would intensify rapidly once the sun vanished behind peaks. In some high camps, residents reportedly placed extra blankets against interior walls to add insulation. The practice created a softer atmosphere inside, but served a practical purpose as well. Fabric layers trapped air and slowed heat loss. A small but vivid anecdote from a mountain diary describes boots left near the stove overnight becoming so warm that leather softened dramatically by morning, only to stiffen again when stepped outside. The contrast between interior and exterior temperatures could be startling. You rise and add another small log to the stove. It catches quickly, flames visible through the small iron door. The warmth deepened, spreading across the cabin floor. Mountain winters demanded endurance similar to that on the plains, yet shaped by terrain and elevation. Fuel might be more plentiful in forested areas, but hauling and chopping at altitude required stamina. Snowfall could isolate settlements for weeks, cutting off supply lines entirely. You step outside one final time before full dark. The snow falls steadily, now flakes drifting down in slow spirals. Pine trees stand silent, their branches heavy. Breath leaves your mouth in thick clouds. The cold here feels crisp and immediate, as if it presses directly against bone. You return inside, quickly closing the sturdy door behind you. The stove glows faintly in the dimming light. Within these log walls, warmth gathers, once again shaped by iron and wood rather than open flame alone. Frozen nights in the mountains carried their own challenges, yet the principles remained familiar. Seal the drafts, manage the fire, layer clothing, share space. You sit back and listen to the soft hiss of snow against timber, aware that whether on open prairie or high ridge, survival always begins with preparation and steady attention to the smallest details. The mountains fade behind you as your thoughts drift eastward along a different line of settlement. Steel rails stretch across frozen ground, cutting through prairie and valley alike. It is winter again, but this time you're not in a family cabin. You're in a railroad camp, temporary and exposed, pitched beside tracks that glint faintly beneath snow. Railroad expansion across the American West accelerated after the completion of the first transcontinental line in 1869. Company payroll records and government reports confirm that thousands of laborers worked year-round, even through brutal winters, laying track across harsh terrain. Work slowed in heavy storms but rarely stopped entirely. You step inside a canvas tent stiff with frost. The fabric snaps slightly in the wind, though guy lines hold it firm. Inside, the air smells of damp wool, smoke and metal. A small pot-bellied stove occupies the center, its pipe angling upward through a carefully cut hole in the canvas. Heat inside such tents was uneven at best. Close to the stove, warmth could feel almost comfortable. A few steps away, cold lingered stubbornly. Men often arranged their bedrolls strategically, jockeying for positions nearer the heat source. You crouch and feed the stove a few pieces of split wood mixed with coal if available. By the 1870s and 1880s, coal had become more accessible in certain territories, transported along the very rails being laid. Company ledgers show shipments of coal distributed to camps during winter months, though supply could be inconsistent. The stove rattles faintly as flame takes hold. Canvas walls glow softly from reflected light. Shadows of men moving within the tent stretch and sway across the fabric. Living quarters in railroad camps were often crowded. Bunkhouses existed in more permanent locations, but mobile crews relied heavily on tents. Cold seeped through the ground beneath them, making raised cots or thick bedrolls essential. There is a curious note in one worker's memoir describing how men sometimes placed spare rail spikes near the stove before bedtime. The heated iron would then be wrapped in cloth and slipped into bedrolls to improvise warmers. The image of hardened steel repurposed for comfort is oddly fitting. Modern labour historians continue to examine how winter conditions affected railroad productivity and worker health. Some suggest that exposure contributed significantly to illness and injury rates in remote camps. Others emphasise that strong communal bonds among crews helped mitigate risks through shared effort and mutual care. You glance toward the tent entrance where frost outlines the flap in delicate patterns. Outside, the half-finished rail line disappears into darkness flanked by snowbanks and scattered tools. The men around you move with practiced efficiency. Boots are dried near the stove. Gloves are hung carefully to prevent stiffening. Wet garments are positioned where rising heat can reach them without scorching. There is little privacy here. Snoring, coughing, quiet murmurs in different accents blend into a rough symphony. Railroad crews were often diverse, including immigrants from Ireland, China, and Eastern Europe. Payroll and employment records confirm this mix, reflecting the broad labour force that fueled westward expansion. You sit on a narrow cot and unroll your bedroll. Layers of wool blanket and heavy canvas create your sleeping space. Beneath the ground remains cold despite efforts to insulate it with boards or straw. Wind presses against the tent walls again, producing a low thrumming sound. The stove glows steadily, but everyone knows it cannot burn unchecked. Fuel must be rationed carefully. Someone will take responsibility for tending it through the night. In especially remote stretches of track supply delays during winter could leave camps short on provisions. Letters from workers occasionally mention thin rations during extended storms. Yet track laying resumed quickly once weather allowed, driven by strict deadlines and financial pressures. You remove your coat but keep several inner layers on. Boots remain within reach just in case. The temperature inside the tent drops rapidly once the stove dims, so vigilance continues even in sleep. A lesser-known detail appears in some railroad accounts, noting that crews sometimes sang softly at night, partly to pass time and partly to keep spirits steady during long stretches of isolation. The sound of low voices in harmony would mingle with the crackle of the stove, creating a fragile pocket of warmth in an otherwise stark environment. You stretch out on the cot and pull blankets high. The air near your face feels cooler than the rest of your body. You adjust your cap lower over your ears. Frozen nights along the rail line were different from those in homesteads or mountain cabins. They were more transient, less rooted. Shelter could be dismantled and moved within days, yet the essentials remained the same. Fire managed carefully, layers worn strategically, shared responsibility for watch. The stove ticks faintly as metal cools and reheats. Outside, the unfinished railway waits beneath snow, promising connection and commerce once winter loosens its grip. Inside the tent, warmth gathers unevenly but sufficiently. You close your eyes, aware that by morning rails will need to be cleared of snow and tools freed from frost. The frontier expanded not only through solitary cabins, but through camps like this one where men endured frozen nights beside steel lines stretching into darkness. The railroad camp fades behind you, and now you find yourself in a different kind of settlement entirely. A mining town clings to the side of a valley, its wooden buildings clustered tightly together as if for comfort. Snow fills the narrow street pressed hard by boots and wagon wheels. Above you, dark slopes rise steeply, their outlines softened by frost. You push open the door to a boarding house and step inside. The warmth hits you in uneven waves. Not luxurious, not abundant, but present. The air smells of coal smoke, damp wool, and something faintly metallic that seems to cling to mining towns everywhere. By the 1870s and 1880s, mining camps across Colorado, Nevada, and Montana supported thousands of workers during winter months. Territorial reports and local newspapers confirm that operations rarely ceased entirely, even in deep cold. Silver, gold, and copper did not wait politely for spring. You remove your gloves and rub your hands together as you glance around the common room. Men sit at rough tables, boots near the stove, faces ruddy from wind and labour. A cast-iron heater stands at the centre, radiating steady warmth. Coal burns inside rather than wood, a sign of the town's proximity to industrial supply routes. Coal heat feels different from wood. It is denser, more consistent, and carries a sharper scent. Fine soot clings faintly to surfaces, darkening walls over time. In many mining towns, coal was both livelihood and fuel pulled from the earth by day and burned by night. You climb the narrow stairs to a shared sleeping room. The ceiling slopes slightly beneath the roofline. Rows of simple beds line the walls, each separated by only a small gap. Blankets are thick but worn layered over straw or thin mattresses. Mining records from the period indicate that many labourers lived in boarding houses rather than private cabins, especially in boom towns that grew quickly around strikes. These communal spaces offered some protection against isolation, though privacy was limited. You sit on the edge of your assigned bed and feel the chill lingering in the corners of the room. Even with the stove downstairs, upper floors can cool rapidly. Heat rises, yes, but drafty construction allows it to escape easily. In especially cold spells, some boarding houses reportedly placed additional stoves on upper floors, though fuel costs made this impractical for smaller establishments. As a result, miners often relied heavily on layered clothing and shared warmth, much like frontier families elsewhere. There is an odd detail preserved in one memoir describing how miners sometimes slept with their heavy wool hosstocks pulled over their hands if mittens were lost or damp. The image is practical and slightly humorous at once, yet it reflects how every scrap of fabric mattered. You lie back and pull the blanket up to your chin. Around you, other men settle in boots set carefully near beds to prevent freezing stiff by morning. The sound of coughing echoes faintly. Dust from mines combined with cold air often irritated lungs. Medical observations from Western territories note increased respiratory ailments during winter among miners who move between frigid outdoors and warmer but smoky interiors. There is an ongoing conversation among labour historians about how winter conditions affected productivity underground. Some argue that deep shafts maintain relatively stable temperatures compared to surface cold, offering a strange kind of relief once miners descended. Others emphasize the dangers of icy equipment and frozen access points above ground. You close your eyes briefly and imagine descending into a mine during winter. Underground temperatures often hovered around a consistent range, neither scorching nor freezing. For some miners, the shaft may have felt almost mild compared to biting wind above. Yet returning to the surface after a shift meant confronting that wind anew. Sweat from the labour could chill quickly, increasing the risk of illness. Proper clothing management was crucial. The boarding house creaks softly as night deepens. Downstairs, the stove continues its steady burn. You can hear faint conversation, then the scrape of a chair, then quiet. Outside, snow settles along rooftops and against door frames. The town, so lively during daylight hours, grows still beneath starlight. You adjust your cap lower over your ears and shift slightly closer to the wall, hoping it blocks at least some draft. Another boarder turns over blankets rustling. Mining towns were often portrayed as rough and rowdy, yet winter nights revealed a quieter side. Men who laboured in darkness by day lay close together under layered blankets, listening to the wind slip along wooden siding. A lesser-known note from a Montana newspaper once described how townsfolk organised communal woodcutting, days before severe winter storms, ensuring boarding houses and homes alike had sufficient fuel. Such cooperation, though less glamorous than tales of gold strikes, sustained communities through cold months. You pull your blanket tighter and focus on the steady rhythm of breathing around you. The stove's warmth filters upward slowly, just enough to keep the room from turning bitter. Frozen nights in mining towns carried their own challenges, shaped by industry and density rather than isolation. Coal heat replaced wood, boarding houses replaced solitary cabins, yet the essentials remained unchanged. Seal the drafts as best you can, keep boots near warmth, share space, tend the fire. Outside the valley lies silent under snow. Inside, beneath worn blankets in a crowded room, you settle into the fragile comfort that carries you through another winter night on the frontier. By late evening, the mining town's main street still flickers with light. You step back outside, boots pressing into snow hardened by countless footsteps. Lanterns glow behind frosted windows, and from one building in particular comes the low hum of voices, layered with laughter. You push open the swinging doors of a saloon and are greeted by a wave of warmth that feels almost extravagant compared to the boarding house. The air inside is thick with smoke from cigars and coal stoves. Lamps cast golden halos across wooden tables scarred by years of elbows and tankards. Frontier towns often revolved socially around establishments like this. Business directories and municipal records from the late 19th century show that saloons outnumbered many other types of public buildings in boomtowns. They were not only places for drink, but gathering points for news, warmth, and company. You remove your gloves and step closer to the stove near the wall. Heat radiates outward in steady pulses. Men stand nearby, rotating slowly like planets around a sun, each taking turns warming hands and backs. The scent inside is layered and complex. Coal smoke, spilled beer, damp wool steaming gently as it dries. The combination is oddly comforting after the sharp sterility of frozen air. You find a seat near the stove and feel warmth seep gradually through your coat. Outside, snow continues to drift along the street, but here conversation rises and falls in easy waves. There is a small but vivid anecdote preserved in a Wyoming newspaper from the 1880s describing how townsfolk once brought blocks of ice indoors during a particularly hot summer to cool a saloon. The reverse of your current situation, yet, it highlights how these establishments adapted to weather extremes in both directions. In winter, saloons sometimes served as informal warming centres. Travellers caught in sudden cold snaps might step inside simply to thaw fingers before continuing on. Though not charitable institutions in the formal sense, they offered temporary refuge from exposure. Some observers of frontier life have suggested that the communal warmth of saloons fostered cooperation during harsh winters. Others caution that alcohol consumption could also exacerbate risks in extreme cold, dulling awareness of danger outdoors. The social impact of these spaces remains a topic of thoughtful examination. You wrap your hands around a warm mug, feeling heat penetrate stiff knuckles. The stove crackles steadily, its metal sides glowing faintly. A pot of stew simmers nearby, adding savoury notes to the air. Men exchange stories of recent storms of cattle nearly lost, of narrow escapes on icy roads. Laughter rises occasionally, but beneath it you sense a shared recognition of winter's seriousness. You glance toward the door as it opens briefly, admitting a gust of frigid air. Snow swirls inside before the door swings shut again. The contrast between inside and out is immediate and dramatic. In some towns, community dances and gatherings were scheduled deliberately during winter months to combat isolation. Notices in territorial newspapers advertised winter socials encouraging attendance despite snow. Human connection became another layer of protection against the mental strain of long cold seasons. You finish your drink slowly, savouring the warmth it provides. Outside, the sky deepens into a dark blue edged with frost. A curious tradition in certain frontier towns involved placing a lantern in a saloon window during especially bitter nights to signal that warmth was available inside. Whether widely practiced or more symbolic than practical, The image reflects a sense of shared survival. You rise and step back into the street. The cold strikes sharply again, reminding you how thin the barrier here truly is between comfort and exposure. Snow crunches beneath your boots as you make your way back toward the boarding house. Behind you, laughter continues faintly through the saloon door. The stove inside will burn late into the night, sustaining conversation and camaraderie. Frozen nights on the frontier were not endured solely in silence. They were met with shared firelight stories and the simple act of gathering close around heat. You pull your coat tighter and lift your collar against the wind. The town glows softly in scattered pools of lamplight, each window representing a pocket of warmth. Inside the boarding house, the stove remains lit. You step through the door and close it firmly, leaving the snow and wind outside once more. Another night settles over the valley and you return to your narrow bed, carrying with you the lingering warmth of shared space and steady flame. By the time you leave the glow of the saloon and settle again into your bed, the town feels quieter than before. Snow absorbs sound, softening even the echo of boots along the boardwalk. You lie awake for a moment, listening to the wind funnel down the narrow valley. And then you think of the storms that did not soften. There were winters in the Old West that entered memory not as cold evenings, but as full-scale calamities. The winter of 1886 to 1887 across the Great Plains stands as one of the most severe in recorded regional history. Ranch reports, newspaper accounts, and government weather logs describe relentless blizzards, sudden temperature drops, and livestock losses on a staggering scale. Cattle that had grazed freely through mild autumns were caught in deep snow and bitter wind. You picture one of those storms beginning almost gently, a grey horizon, a wind that sharpens by degrees, then within hours white-out conditions so complete that land and sky merge into a single swirling sheet. In such blizzards, orientation vanished. Settlers sometimes tied ropes between house and barn to avoid losing their way in storms that erased even nearby landmarks. The rope became a lifeline, something tangible in a world reduced to noise and ice. You imagine Drew gripping such a line, leaning into wind so strong it pushes breath back into your lungs. Snow stings at any so's skin, eyelashes freeze together in seconds. Meteorological records from frontier forts confirm that temperature drops of 40 degrees or more could occur within a single day during certain cold fronts. Combined with high winds, the effective chill was deadly. Inside cabins during these legendary storms, fires were tended constantly. Wood piles dwindled rapidly. Families rationed fuel carefully, sometimes burning furniture scraps or fence rails when supplies ran low. There is a striking anecdote from a Nebraska homestead in which a family reportedly stacked mattresses against a north-facing wall during a blizzard to block drafts so intense they caused frost to form inside the room. Whether the detail has been embellished over time is unclear, yet similar improvisations appear in multiple recollections. Debate persists among environmental historians about how much of the Great Die-Up resulted from overconfidence in open-range ranching versus sheer meteorological misfortune. Some argue that inadequate preparation and insufficient feed storage amplified losses. Others contend that the storms were so extraordinary that even cautious ranchers would have struggled. You lie still and consider how those nights must have felt. The cabin creaking under wind pressure, snow piling high against doors, the constant roar outside drowning conversation. In mining towns, avalanches sometimes followed such storms, burying cabins and cutting off roads. In railroad camps, tents could collapse under heavy accumulation, forcing crews to dig out their own shelter before dawn. There is also the human side of these events. Newspapers from the period recount stories of neighbors rescuing stranded families of entire communities working together to clear paths once wind subsided. Winter revealed both vulnerability and solidarity. You imagined stepping outside after such a storm finally passed, the world transformed, drifts towering above fence lines, chimneys, chimneys so profound it feels sacred. A curious belief circulated in some rural communities that the first bird call after a major blizzard signalled that the worst had passed. Whether superstition or simple relief at hearing life again, the moment carried symbolic weight. Climate researchers examining tree ring data and historical weather patterns continue to piece together how these extreme winters fit into broader climatic cycles. Some suggest that a series of particularly harsh seasons influence settlement patterns and agricultural practices long after the storms themselves faded from headlines. You pull your blanket closer, grateful that tonight's snowfall remains gentle rather than catastrophic. The boarding house walls stand firm, the stove glows steadily downstairs, yet you understand now that frozen nights in the Old West were not uniform experiences. Some passed quietly managed with routine vigilance, others roared in with force capable of reshaping entire industries. The wind outside tonight is steady but not violent. Snow drifts softly along rooftops rather than hurling itself sideways in fury. You close your eyes and imagine the rope stretched between house and barn taut against the gale. A simple line yet emblematic of resilience. A reminder that preparation often meant thinking ahead to the worst possibilities. As sleep returns, you feel the weight of history layered into these winters. Not just cold as a sensation, but cold as an event capable of altering fortunes, testing communities and rewriting plans. The stove continues its steady warmth below. The town rests beneath fresh snow, and you drift into rest, knowing that while some storms change the course of lives, tonight remains manageable, another frozen chapter carried safely toward dawn. Morning comes pale and slow, and with it is a different kind of awareness. You wake not from cold this time, but from hunger, a deep steady ache in your stomach that reminds you how much energy your body burned through the night simply staying warm. Winter survival on the frontier was not only about shelter and fire, it was about calories. You rise and make your way toward the kitchen area of the boarding house, or perhaps in your mind you are back in a homestead cabin with a rough wooden table near the hearth. Either way, the principle holds. Cold demands fuel from the body just as fire demands fuel from woodpile or coal scuttle. 19th century dietary records and household account books from Western settlements show that winter meals were often heavy and rich when supplies allowed. Salt pork beans, cornbread biscuits, potatoes and thick stews appear frequently in journals and store inventories. These foods were dense in fat and carbohydrates, exactly what bodies required to generate heat. You sit at the table and watch as a pot of beans simmers over steady flame. The scent is earthy and savoury, filling the room with warmth even before the first bite. A slab of bacon sizzles in a cast-iron pan, releasing a rich aroma that seems to push back against the chill lingering in corners. Fat was prized in winter. It carried more calories per ounce than lean meat, making it valuable in cold climates. Frontier families often saved drippings, carefully storing lard in tins for cooking and even for spreading on bread. Energy was not counted in abstract numbers then, but in how long you could work outdoors without shivering. Military supply logs from Western forts indicate that soldiers stationed in colder territories received rations, including salt beef, hardtack coffee, and occasionally molasses. The composition reflected practical needs rather than culinary elegance. You wrap your hands around a tin cup of hot coffee and feel the heat travel into your palms. The first swallow warms your throat and chest in a way that feels almost medicinal. There is a lesson and custom recorded in some rural communities of adding a small amount of whiskey to coffee during particularly bitter mornings. The belief was that it stoked internal warmth. Modern physiology suggests that alcohol may create a fleeting sensation of heat while actually increasing heat loss, yet the practice persisted in many places. Ongoing nutritional studies examining frontier diets suggest that while meals were calorically dense, they were not always balanced. Fresh produce was scarce in winter, leading to deficiencies in certain vitamins. Yet sheer energy intake often mattered more immediately than long-term variety when facing sub-zero nights. You break open a biscuit and let steam rise from its centre. Butter melts quickly across its surface. The texture is crumbly and satisfying. You feel warmth building, not just from the stove but from within. On ranches, winter feeding required careful planning. Cattle that lacked sufficient body fat entering the season were less likely to survive prolonged cold. Ranch journals frequently mention the importance of autumn weight gain before the first frost. You think of last night's animals standing clustered against wind. Their survival too depended on stored energy. In especially remote settlements, hunting supplemented winter diets. Deer elk and smaller game provided fresh meat when preserved supplies ran low. Trapping for fur also contributed to income during colder months, linking sustenance and trade. A curious detail from a Kansas homestead diary describes children being given spoonfuls of molasses before bedtime during winter, believed to help them stay warm through the night. Whether scientifically sound or simply comforting is difficult to determine. Yet the ritual reveals a shared understanding that food equaled resilience. You finish your meal slowly aware of the strength returning to your limbs. Hunger recedes, replaced by steady warmth spreading outward from your core. Frozen nights demanded more than blankets and banked coals. They required preparation long before darkness fell. Stored grain in barrels, smoked meat hanging from rafters, root vegetables tucked into cellars beneath straw for insulation. Archaeological excavations of frontier homesteads often uncover root cellars dug into hillsides, their cool, stable temperatures preserving potatoes, turnips, and carrots through winter months. These underground chambers acted as natural refrigerators safeguarding precious food. You stand and help clear the table, noticing how quickly steam from dishes fades in the cool air. The stove remains lit, radiating dependable heat. Energy intake fire. Management shelter construction layered clothing. Each element forms part of a larger system. Remove one and the balance shifts. As you step back outside into the pale winter light, your breath still forms white clouds, yet your body feels steadier now. Fuel has been added not only to the hearth, but to you. The prairie beyond remains frozen. Snow lies in smooth drifts, but within warmth circulates through blood and muscle, strengthening your ability to face another day. On the old west frontier, surviving frozen nights began long before the first gust of wind. It began at the table in the careful storage of food and the understanding that cold demands nourishment just as surely as it demands fire. And as the day brightens slowly across the snowbound land, you carry that quiet strength forward, ready to meet whatever the next night brings. After breakfast, you step outside with a different concern pressing at the edges of your mind. Firewood can be chopped, blankets can be layered, food can be stored, but water in winter becomes a silent challenge. The snow under your boots squeaks faintly, a dry, brittle sound that signals deep cold. Your breath drifts upward into pale clouds as you walk toward the well or pump at the edge of the yard. The wooden handle is rimed with frost metal fittings dulled by ice. You grip the handle and pull. It resists at first, frozen. On the frontier, access to water during winter required vigilance. Homestead records and agricultural reports from the late 19th century note that shallow wells were particularly vulnerable to freezing in prolonged cold spells. Families often insulated well housings with straw boards or even packed earth to prevent ice from forming along pump mechanisms. You brush snow away from the base and peer down into the dark shaft. A faint glimmer of water lies below, but a thin crust has formed at the surface. You fetch a metal rod kept nearby for precisely this purpose and lower it, carefully tapping through the fragile ice layer. The sound echoes hollowly. Ice cracks and breaks, allowing access again. You haul up a bucket slowly, the rope stiff in your hands. Water management extended beyond wells. Streams and rivers froze solid in many territories, forcing settlers to cut blocks of ice or carve narrow channels to reach flowing water beneath. Military journals from western forts describe daily routines of chopping through river ice to secure drinking water for both soldiers and livestock. You carry the bucket back toward the cabin, careful not to spill. Even a small loss matters when freezing conditions require repeated effort to replace it. Inside, you set the bucket near the stove to prevent it from icing over again too quickly. Some households stored water in covered barrels within the warmest part of the room during winter, minimizing exposure to cold drafts. There is a striking detail from one frontier memoir recounting how families sometimes kept a small kettle of water simmering almost continuously during extreme cold, not only for drinking, but to maintain a slightly more humid atmosphere. Dry air from constant heating could irritate lungs and skin. You pour a portion of the water into a pot and place it near the flame. Steam begins to rise faintly. The simple act of melting ice into usable water feels quietly triumphant. Ongoing research into frontier sanitation practices suggests that winter posed unique challenges. Frozen ground, complicated waste disposal, and contaminated water sources could spread illness rapidly if precautions were not taken. Clean water required constant attention. You recall how, last night, the air inside felt sharp and dry. The small addition of steam now softens it slightly, easing the tightness in your throat. Outside livestock require water as well. Cattle often struggled when ponds froze over entirely. Ranchers sometimes used axes to break ice daily, or relied on windmills to keep water moving. Wind-powered pumps, introduced more widely in the late 19th century, helped draw groundwater, continuously reducing the likelihood of total freeze. You step back outside with another bucket heading toward the animal enclosure. The cold grips your face immediately. Snow glitters in bright sunlight reflected so intensely it almost dazzles. At the trough, a thin sheet of ice has formed again. You strike it gently with the rod, shattering it into jagged pieces. The sound rings sharply in the quiet air. A curious belief in some rural communities held that leaving a small wooden board floating on a trough would reduce ice formation. The theory was that it disrupted surface freezing patterns. Whether effective or symbolic, the practice appears in more than one account. You pour fresh water into the trough and watch as animals lower their heads gratefully. Steam rises from their muzzles, blending with cold air. Water so abundant in warmer months becomes labour in winter. Each bucket hauled, each crust broken, reinforces the effort required to maintain basic life. Some frontier households reportedly stored snow indoors in large tubs, allowing it to melt gradually near the hearth as a supplementary source. The method worked, though it required careful monitoring to avoid chilling the interior space excessively. Scholars examining daily routines in frontier diaries often emphasize how much time winter chores consumed. Tasks that were simple in summer doubled in effort once ice and snow entered the equation. You return inside once more, setting fresh water near the stove. The warmth from the fire keeps it liquid, though you know you will need to check it again by nightfall. Frozen nights in the Old West were not only about surviving air temperature, they were about managing every essential element under shifting conditions. Fire, food, clothing, and water formed a delicate balance. You wipe your hands dry and glance at the hearth flames, steady and reassuring. Outside, the sun climbs slightly higher, yet the air remains bitter. By evening, temperatures will drop again. The well will need checking. The trough will ice over once more. For now, though, water flows freely inside your cabin. Steam rises gently from the pot near the fire. The simple presence of liquid warmth offers quiet comfort against a landscape locked in frost. As afternoon light begins to thin again, your attention shifts toward the smallest figures moving about the cabin. Children do not experience winter in quite the same measured way as adults. For them, cold can feel sudden, sharp, and unfair. You watch as a young child presses a hand against the frosted window, tracing patterns in the condensation before quickly pulling fingers back from the chill. The air near the glass is noticeably colder than at the centre of the room. Frontier family records from the 19th century reveal sobering truths about childhood vulnerability during harsh winters. Census data and medical reports from territorial settlements show higher rates of illness among children during cold months, particularly respiratory infections. Drafty housing smoke filled interiors and limited medical access compounded the risks. You kneel beside this child and adjust the shawl wrapped around small shoulders. Layers matter even more for smaller bodies which lose heat more rapidly. You pull stockings higher, smooth wool across knees, and tuck blankets closer when evening comes. In many homesteads, parents positioned cradles or small beds nearest the hearth during severe cold spells. Heat radiated outward unevenly, and careful placement could mean a few precious degrees of warmth. Furniture arrangement became a strategic decision. There is an intriguing detail preserved in a Dakota Territory diary describing how mothers sometimes sewed extra flannel lining into children's nightclothes before winter fully set in. The added fabric increased insulation without adding too much bulk, allowing children to move freely. You lift a small pair of mittens drying near the stove and test their warmth. Once dry, they will be returned to eager hands for brief outdoor play. Even in winter, children sought moments of movement in snow. Laughter carried differently across frozen air, crisp and bright. Educational attendance records from frontier towns indicate that schools often closed temporarily during extreme cold snaps, especially when buildings lack sufficient heating. Teachers and families weighed the value of lessons against the danger of travel in sub-zero conditions. You imagine children walking along snow-packed paths, scarves wrapped tightly, breath visible in rhythmic clouds. Inside small schoolhouses, pot-bellied stoves glowed steadily, students rotating seats closer to warmth throughout the day. There is also the emotional side of winter for children. Long nights confined indoors could stir restlessness. Storytelling, simple games, and shared chores filled hours that might otherwise feel endless. A lesser-known custom in certain settlements involved placing warmed bricks wrapped in cloth at the foot of children's beds. The practice echoed the techniques used by adults, but was applied with extra care to avoid burns. Researchers examining frontier family life continue to explore how seasonal hardship shaped childhood development. Some suggest that early exposure to responsibility fostered resilience. Others emphasize the toll that repeated illness and loss could take on young communities. You stir a pot of stew and call the children closer as evening settles in. Hot meals become part of winter defense. You watch as small hands cradle bowls, carefully steam rising in gentle spirals. Outsea, gray twilight deepens quickly. Frost creeps once more along the edges of the window. The cabin glows softly from firelight, casting warm hues across wooden walls. You gather the children near the hearth before bedtime, guiding them through the familiar sequence. Extra layer. Cap pulled tight, socks adjusted, blankets fluffed and tucked. There is tenderness in these gestures, yet also vigilance. Small bodies cannot afford prolonged exposure. Even brief drafts can steal warmth rapidly. A curious belief in some rural communities held that singing softly before sleep could calm children enough to reduce restless tossing that might dislodge blankets. Whether rooted in psychology or tradition, the lullabies served both comfort and practical purpose. You sit beside a narrow bed and smooth a blanket one final time. The child beneath it sighs softly, already drifting. Winter on the frontier was not experienced equally. Adults bore the weight of preparation, yet children carried their own share of risk. Protection extended beyond walls and fuel. It required attentive hands and constant adjustment. As the fire settles into its evening rhythm, you step back and observe the small forms tucked securely under layers of wool and quilt. The cabin feels fuller not only with warmth but with quiet purpose. Outside, the prairie darkens under a canopy of stars. Inside, you have shaped a space where young lives can rest safely through another frozen night. When the children's breathing deepens and the cabin grows still again, a different sensation settles over you. It is not cold exactly, it is quiet. Winter on the frontier carried a particular kind of silence. Snow-muffled hoofbeats and wagon wheels. Wind carved across open land without interruption. Distances felt larger when fields lay empty and white beneath a pale moon. You step outside briefly before turning in for the night. The sky stretches above you in a clear sweep of stars. The prairie looks endless, a frozen ocean under silver light. No lantern glows nearby. No neighbour's chimney. Smoke drifts across the horizon. Frontier homesteads were often separated by miles rather than yards. Land grant maps and early county plats show properties spaced widely across plains and valleys. In winter, heavy snowfall could isolate families for days or even weeks. You stand in the yard and feel how solitude presses differently in cold air. The quiet seems amplified as if every thought echoes further. There is a detail from one settler's letter describing how the sound of a distant wolf howl carried farther across snow than during other seasons. Whether due to atmospheric conditions or simple stillness, the cry seemed closer than it truly was. Inside the cabin, you return to the hearth and sit for a moment listening. The fire crackles softly. A log shifts with a faint pop. Beyond that, nothing. Ongoing discussions among social historians consider how prolonged winter isolation influenced mental resilience on the frontier. Some suggest that solitude strengthened self-reliance and introspection. Others argue that extended separation from community increased stress and melancholy during harsh seasons. You glance toward the window where frost has painted intricate shapes. Beyond it lies an immense quiet expanse. In summer, that same view might carry movement. Grazing cattle, passing wagons, dust rising in heat. Now it holds stillness. There is a curious anecdote recorded in a Kansas homestead journal, where a woman wrote that she sometimes spoke aloud to the wind during long winter evenings, simply to hear a human voice in the room. Whether done in jest or sincerity, the act underscores how silence can weigh heavily. You stir the embers gently, not because they need urgent attention, but to create a small sound. The faint crackle reassures you. Winter solitude did not always mean complete isolation. Letters travelled slowly but persistently. Mail routes operated whenever roads allowed, and the arrival of a letter in snowbound months often carried profound emotional warmth. Postal records from frontier territories show surprisingly consistent delivery schedules despite seasonal challenges. Riders braved icy trails and swollen rivers to maintain connection between distant settlements. You imagine receiving such a letter on a frozen evening, breaking the seal by firelight, reading familiar handwriting while snow drifts silently outside. You wrap your coat tighter around yourself and sit near the hearth once more. The cabin walls enclose you, yet beyond them stretches a landscape vast enough to swallow sound entirely. Loneliness can feel sharper in cold weather. Darkness falls earlier. Tasks shrink to indoor routines. Hours stretch long between sunset and dawn. Yet there is also clarity here. The absence of noise reveals subtle details. The way frost forms along a beam, the rhythm of your own breathing, the steady pulse of embers beneath ash. Some frontier families reportedly mark the passing of winter nights by scratching small notches into a wooden beam, counting days until spring thaw. Whether widespread or isolated practice is uncertain, but the gesture reflects a human need to measure time when seasons feel endless. You close your eyes briefly and imagine neighbours miles away performing similar rituals, tending fires, tucking children beneath quilts, listening to wind slide across snow. Though separated by distance, the experience is shared. You rise at last and bank the fire carefully for the coming hours. The glow dims slightly, settling into steady red beneath grey ash. As you slip beneath blankets once more, the quiet returns. It is deep and complete, yet not entirely empty. Beyond the walls, stars burn steadily over frozen fields. Within, warmth gathers in small, steady pockets. Frozen nights on the frontier were not only tests of endurance, but encounters with solitude. In that vast silence, you learn the weight of your own thoughts and the quiet resilience of shared human routines. And as sleep draws near, the prairie remains vast and still, holding your cabin, like a small flickering ember in a sea of frost. Sometime after midnight, you wake to a sound that does not belong to wind or settling timber. It is a long, low moan carried across the frozen prairie. You hold still, listening carefully. The fire glows faintly. The cabin remains intact, yet the sound lingers. Winter nights in the Old West often carried unfamiliar noises. Ice shifting along a distant river could produce deep groans. Wind slipping through narrow rock formations might create tones almost musical in their resonance. In a landscape stripped of summer insects and rustling grass, each sound felt amplified. You rise quietly and move toward the door, pressing your ear against it. The moan comes again, softer this time. It could be cattle shifting in their shelter. It could be timber contracting under extreme cold. There is a fascinating note in several frontier memoirs describing how settlers sometimes attributed such sounds to spirits moving across the plains. In regions where indigenous traditions already spoke of winter spirits or wandering figures in snow, these interpretations blended with European folklore, creating a shared vocabulary for explaining the unknown. Weather logs from western forts confirm that extreme cold can cause wooden beams and even frozen ground to crack sharply, Rapid temperature drops place stress on materials, producing noises that might unsettle anyone unprepared. You wrap a shawl around your shoulders and step outside briefly. The sky is clear, the moon high and bright. Snow reflects its light so intensely that shadows appear blue against the white ground. The sound comes again, and this time you recognize it as wind slipping through the narrow space between barn and fence. The structure funnels air into a low, sustained tone. You exhale slowly, a small smile forming at the corners of your mouth. Yet not all winter sounds were so easily explained. Some communities develop quiet rituals to reassure themselves during long, dark months. In certain settlements, families place small charms near doorways during winter storms, believing they discouraged wandering spirits from entering the home. While such practices may appear quaint, they served a psychological function. In an environment where control felt limited, small symbolic gestures restored a sense of agency. Researchers examining folklore on the frontier often note how winter intensified storytelling traditions. Long nights encouraged tales of phantom riders, mysterious lights, and protective household spirits. Whether rooted in earlier cultural heritage or shaped by local experience, these narratives added texture to cold evenings. You step back inside and close the door gently. The cabin feels warmer than the open yard, though still crisp at the edges. There is an anecdote preserved in a Montana newspaper recounting how townsfolk once mistook the reflection of moonlight on drifting snow for distant lanterns approaching across the plain. Excitement turned to mild embarrassment when no visitors appeared. Light and shadow in winter can deceive even the steady-eyed. You sit near the hearth and stir the embers softly, allowing a faint flame to rise. The room brightens slightly, shadows retreating towards its corners. Outside of the prairie lies silent once more. The earlier moan fades into memory. Modern scholars exploring frontier belief systems continue to consider how isolation and environmental extremes influence spiritual interpretation. Some argue that harsh climates heighten sensitivity to unexplained phenomena. Others suggest that storytelling provided comfort rather than fear. You pull your blanket closer around your shoulders and listen to the steady rhythm of fire. There is something profound about how winter strips away distraction. In its place, imagination fills gaps. A creaking beam becomes a voice, a distant animal cry becomes an omen. Yet experience gradually teaches discernment. Wind through fence slats, ice along riverbanks, timber adjusting to cold. You glance at the frosted window. Moonlight casts intricate patterns across its surface, transforming ice crystals into delicate art. You think of neighbours miles away, perhaps hearing similar sounds and drawing their own conclusions. Frozen nights on the frontier were not only physical challenges, but landscapes for belief and interpretation. In the absence of electric light and constant noise, the mind wandered easily into myth. The fire settles again into a low, steady glow. The cabin holds firm. Outside wind shifts direction, carrying only the soft hiss of snow across open land. You return to bed and pull the buffalo robe high. The mysterious sound has been understood, reduced to airflow and wood. Still, you cannot help but glance once more toward the door before closing your eyes. Winter has a voice. Sometimes it whispers through beams and fence posts. Sometimes it roars across plains. And sometimes it hums softly beneath a bright moon, reminding you that in this vast frozen world every sound carries meaning, until you learn to hear it clearly. By the time you drift fully back to sleep, the moon has crossed high overhead. When you open your eyes again, you are no longer in a cabin or boarding house. In your mind, you stand within the square walls of a frontier fort, its palisades rising stark and pale against a winter sky. Life at remote military posts across the Western Territories followed strict routines even in the coldest months. Official army records from the mid to late 19th century detail daily schedules that continued through winter, including drill sentry duty and maintenance of equipment. Snow did not cancel discipline. You step across the hard-packed yard of the fort. Snow crunches under your boots. Barracks line one side officers' quarters, another. Smoke rises steadily from chimneys' thin grey lines dissolving into icy air. Inside the barracks, rows of bunks stretch along the walls. Each holds folded blankets, a bedroll, and perhaps a small personal item tucked carefully beneath. The air smells of wool leather and coal smoke. Coal was frequently supplied to western forts by rail once lines reached nearby towns. Quartermaster reports show shipments allocated carefully during winter months. Wood remained in use at more isolated posts, but coal offered more consistent heat when available. You sit on a narrow bunk and remove your gloves. The room is warm enough to be comfortable but not indulgent. Heat is measured and controlled, distributed through stoves placed strategically along the length of the barracks. Sentries rotate through night watch regardless of temperature. Guard duty at frontier forts was not suspended during blizzards unless conditions became truly catastrophic. Military journals recount soldiers pacing icy perimeters beneath starlight rifles slung breath-rising in steady plumes. There is a lesser-known detail from one fort's records noting that soldiers sometimes stuffed newspaper inside their boots during winter marches to add insulation. The simple trick echoes similar improvisations among civilians, revealing how resourcefulness crossed social lines. You glance toward the parade ground where snow lies smooth and untouched. In warmer seasons, drills and formations would fill this space with movement. Now it rests under frost. Researchers studying military life on the frontier continue to assess how extreme winter conditions affected morale and discipline. Some argue that shared hardships strengthened unit cohesion. Others suggest that monotony and cold tested patience and endurance. Inside the mess hall, a large stove glows steadily. Soldiers gather around long tables consuming rations designed to sustain them through cold duty hours. Salt pork beans, bread and coffee appear frequently in supply inventories. You sit at the table and wrap your hands around a tin cup. The warmth seeps slowly into chilled fingers. In certain forts, chaplains or officers organized evening readings or music during winter months to break the quiet monotony of cold nights. Letters home mentioned small gatherings where harmonicas or fiddles accompanied low voices. Outside the fort walls, snow stretches across open land. Inside, routine provides structure against winter's unpredictability. A curious anecdote from a Texas frontier post describes how a soldier once attempted to sleep with his boots too close to the stove, only to wake with one sole partially scorched. Practical lessons were sometimes learned the hard way. You rise and walk along the interior wall, running your hand lightly across the timber. Unlike civilian cabins, forts were often constructed with more uniform materials, though still vulnerable to drafts and settling. Guard relief sounds faintly across the yard as one sentry replaces another. The exchange is quiet, efficient, and unceremonious. Frozen nights at military posts were shaped by order. Fires were tended according to schedule. Watches rotated predictably. Supplies were inventoried carefully. Yet even within this structure, the same principles applied. Seal drafts, maintain steady heat, layer clothing, share space. You stand once more at the doorway of the barracks and look out across the snow-covered yard. The fort's walls enclose a small world of discipline and routine holding winter at bay through organization rather than improvisation alone. As night deepens again, the stoves glow steadily inside each building. Soldiers settle into bunks beneath layered blankets. The cold remains beyond the palisade, vast and impersonal. Within, warmth persists through planning, shared responsibility, and steady firelight. Frozen nights in the Old West reached into forts as surely as they did into cabins and camps. The difference lay not in the temperature, but in the rhythm by which people met it. And as you return to your bunk in imagination, the steady glow of coal and the predictable cadence of guard duty carry you safely through another stretch of darkness. The fort fades from your mind and you find yourself once more on an open stretch of road. Snow lies thick across the prairie and a stagecoach sits tilted slightly to one side, its wheels half buried in drifted white. You're inside it now, knees pressed close to strangers' breath fogging the narrow interior. Stagecoach travel across the American West continued through winter whenever possible. Company timetables from the 1870s and 1880s show routes operating year-round, though delays were common during severe storms. Mail and passengers alike relied on these lines to connect distant settlements. The coach rocks faintly as wind pushes against its wooden frame. Outside, the driver and a helper attempt to clear snow from the wheels, their movements muffled by thick scarves and heavy coats. Inside, space is limited. Seats line both sides, passengers facing one another. Blankets are shared awkwardly draped over laps and shoulders. The air smells of damp wool and leather. You pull your coat tighter and shift closer to the person beside you, instinctively conserving warmth. Body heat accumulates slowly within the cramped compartment, though drafts slip in through cracks around doors and windows. There is a quiet tension in this enclosed space. No one speaks loudly. Breath and the faint creak of wood dominate the soundscape. In documented accounts of winter stage travel, passengers often described the fear of becoming stranded overnight in remote stretches of road. Letters preserved in regional archives recount instances where coaches were forced to halt for hours or even days until drifts could be cleared. You glance at the small frosted window. Outside snow whirls sideways and gusts erasing tracks almost as soon as they're made. A curious practice mentioned in several travel diaries involved passengers stamping their feet in unison during prolonged stops to maintain circulation. The synchronized movement created a dull thumping rhythm inside the coach, a shared effort to ward off numbness. You press your boots firmly against the floorboards and flex your toes. Even layered stockings struggle against prolonged exposure to cold seeping upward from the ground. The driver calls out briefly, voice carried through wind. Work continues outside. Researchers studying transportation history note that winter travel risks contributed to the gradual expansion of railroads as safer alternatives. Stage routes remained vital for many years, yet the unpredictability of storms underscored their vulnerability. You glance around at your fellow passengers. A woman clutches a small satchel close to her chest. A man rubs his gloved hands together repeatedly. A child sits between two adults bundled in layers of wool. You reach into your bag and retrieve a small tin cup. Someone passes around a flask of hot coffee poured carefully to avoid spills. The warmth spreads slowly through chilled fingers and stiff wrists. Outside wind subsides slightly. The driver's silhouette appears briefly through swirling snow as he signals that wheels are nearly freed. There is a faint cheer inside the coach, subdued but sincere. Yet night approaches quickly in winter. Even if movement resumes, reaching the next station before dark is uncertain. Stage stations spaced along major routes provided shelter, fresh horses, and hot meals when weather allowed. Company records list these stops at regular intervals, though distance between them could stretch dangerously long in remote areas. You imagine the relief of reaching one such station after hours in a stalled coach. Stepping inside to find a blazing hearth, dry space, and perhaps a bowl of stew. A lesser-known detail from a Colorado newspaper recounts how a stranded coach once used its own seat cushions as additional insulation against interior drafts during a blizzard. Practical improvisation once again proved essential. The driver finally climbs back onto his seat. The coach lurches forward with a jolt as wheels break free from the snow's grip. Inside, passengers brace themselves. The journey resumes slower than before, but moving. You feel the vibration of wheels beneath your boots and sense a collective exhale among those around you. Frozen nights on the frontier did not spare travellers. Whether in cabins, forts, camps, or stagecoaches, the same principles applied. Preserve heat, conserve energy, share space. As dusk begins to descend across the white expanse, the coach rattles onward toward the promise of shelter ahead. You tighten your blanket once more and focus on the rhythm of movement, grateful that wheels turn again and that for tonight at least you are not stranded beneath an open sky. The stagecoach eventually reaches a way station just as the last of the light drains from the sky. You step down onto snow packed hard by earlier travellers and feel the relief of solid ground beneath your boots. The station itself is modest, little more than a wooden structure with a stable attached, but smoke rises from its chimney in a reassuring curl. Inside, warmth gathers in uneven layers. A wide hearth dominates one wall, flames rising steadily around thick logs. The air smells of hay-horse sweat and stew simmering somewhere out of sight. You rub your hands near the fire and notice how quickly sensation returns to your fingers. Travel cold is different from cabin cold. It seeps through movement and lingers stubbornly in joints. Improvisation often defined winter survival at remote stations like this. Supply lines were unpredictable and hosts relied on simple tools to stretch warmth as far as possible. Heated stones, bricks, and even iron tools placed near the hearth were repurposed as portable heat sources once wrapped in cloth. You pick up a smooth stone resting near the fire and test its warmth carefully. It radiates gentle heat, not scorching but steady. Someone nearby wraps a similar stone in a thick rag and tucks it into a bedroll prepared for a weary passenger. Archaeological surveys of stage stations across the West have uncovered remnants of such hearth-side practices, including clusters of fire-blackened stones and improvised warming implements. These small details hint at the practical creativity of those who managed constant turnover of cold travellers. You settle onto a narrow bench along the wall, boots extended toward the fire but not too close. Leather left directly against flame can stiffen or warp once cooled. A man across the room shakes snow from his coat and remarks quietly about a trick he learned during a harsh winter near the Platte River. He claims that placing a folded newspaper inside his vest once helped trap body heat during the long ride. The idea seems simple, yet paper layered beneath wool can indeed reduce heat loss by capturing pockets of air. There is ongoing discussion among historians of daily life about how often such small adaptations went unrecorded. Formal documents preserve major events and economic data, but personal ingenuity appears mostly in letters and passing remarks. You accept a bowl of stew and cradle it in both hands. Steam curls upward, carrying the scent of beans and salted meat. Each spoonful spreads warmth outward from your core. Outside wind picks up again, rattling the shutters. The station keeper checks the stable doors, ensuring horses are shielded from drafts. Animals require protection here just as they do at homesteads and forts. Some stations reportedly kept spare blankets specifically for travellers arriving unexpectedly at night. These items were used repeatedly, mended often, and valued highly. You glance toward the sleeping area at the back of the room. Cots are arranged in a row, separated by little more than inches. Privacy is secondary to warmth. In one preserved travel journal, a passenger described how strangers sometimes slept nearly shoulder to shoulder at isolated stations during blizzards, not out of camaraderie alone, but because proximity improved survival odds. The observation is practical and understated. The fire crackles loudly now as another log is added. Sparks rise briefly and vanish up the chimney. You finish your meal and carry the warmed stone to your assigned cot. The bedding is simple but sufficient. You slide the stone near your feet beneath the blanket and feel its heat begin to diffuse slowly. The room dims as lanterns are lowered. Shadows lengthen across rough plank walls. Frozen nights along travel routes required flexibility. Travellers adapted to shared spaces, shifting plans, and whatever resources were at hand. You stretch out carefully, boots placed within easy reach. The warmed stone radiates steadily against your soles, easing the lingering chill from hours in the coach. Outside, snow swirls once more across open land. Inside, the hearth glows confidently, anchoring this small outpost against the dark. You close your eyes and listen to the subtle sounds of others settling in. A cough, the rustle of blankets, the faint whinny of a horse from the stable. Improvised warmth, shared shelter, steady flame. These are the tools that carry you through another frozen night on the frontier, whether in a permanent home or a temporary stop along the road. As sleep begins to take hold, you feel the gentle heat at your feet and know that even in the most modest station, human ingenuity continues to shape survival against the cold. By the time you wake, the storm has softened into a fine glittering frost that clings to every rail and fence post. The stage station stirs quietly around you, travellers rising one by one, breath visible in the cool morning air. You sit up slowly, noticing how the warmed stone at your feet has cooled completely, its stored heat spent during the night. You dress in layers once more, then pause as the station keeper distributes a small stack of letters delivered by the last rider before the storm closed the road. Letters in winter carried a particular weight. Postal service across the expanding West improved steadily after the 1860s, especially once rail connections shortened delivery times between territories. Government reports from the period document an expanding network of post routes that operated through harsh conditions whenever possible. Even in winter, mail moved, though sometimes slowly and with risk. You accept a folded envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. The paper feels slightly stiff from cold edges, rough, where snow may have touched it before being brushed away. You move closer to the hearth before breaking the seal. Ink appears darker in firelight letters, forming shapes that connect you instantly to someone far away. Perhaps a sibling in the east, perhaps a friend who chose a different path westward. Diaries from frontier settlers frequently describe the emotional impact of winter correspondence. A letter arriving during a snowbound week could lift spirits more effectively than extra firewood. Words bridged distances that snow made impassable. You read slowly, aware of how the room quiets around you. Others lean against walls or sit near the stove, each absorbed in their own messages. The crackle of flame and the soft murmur of pages turning create a gentle rhythm. There is a small yet memorable note in one Montana homestead journal, recounting how a woman once reread the same letter every evening for a month during a particularly isolated winter. The repetition did not dull its warmth. Instead, it deepened her connection to the sender. Researchers who examine frontier communication often highlight how letters shaped perceptions of winter hardship. Writers sometimes downplayed difficulties to avoid worrying relatives. Others described frozen nights in vivid detail, perhaps seeking empathy or validation. You fold your letter carefully and tuck it into your coat. The words linger, adding a subtle warmth that does not come from fire or food. Beyond the station, the prairie remains white and still. The road ahead will require effort once more. Snow must be navigated. Wheels must turn. You think about how written accounts preserved much of what we know about winter survival in the Old West. Without diaries, journals, and letters, the daily rhythms of banking fires and hauling water might have faded from memory. Historical archive contain countless references to frozen wells, stalled trains, and families huddled near hearths during blizzards. Yet they also reveal humour and resilience threaded through hardship. A curious detail appears in one Wyoming letter, where a traveller sketched a tiny snowman in the margin, labelling it "my sant winter companion." Even in cold and isolation, imagination found room to play. There remains an ongoing discussion among cultural historians about how narratives of frontier winter shaped broader myths of toughness and endurance. Some argue that later retellings amplified severity to emphasize heroism. Others contend that the hardship itself required little embellishment. You step outside the station once more and glance at the horizon. The sky is clear, pale blue against the white expanse. Breath drifts from your lips in soft clouds. The coach driver signals that departure will resume shortly. Horses stamp in the stable, eager or perhaps simply restless. You climb aboard a gain letter, tucked safely inside your coat. The interior of the coach feels familiar now, its confined warmth almost comforting. As wheels begin to roll across the crusted snow, you reflect on how winter survival was never solely physical. Fire and blankets protected the body, words sustained the spirit. Frozen nights on the frontier demanded ingenuity, vigilance, cooperation, and sometimes simply patience. The coach rattles forward along the road, leaving faint tracks across the frozen plain. Behind you, the stage station shrinks into a dark speck against white. Ahead, another settlement awaits, another hearth, another evening where snow gathers against walls and ends glow beneath ash. And tucked close to your heart, a letter that carries warmth across miles of frozen land. The days begin almost imperceptibly to lengthen. You notice it first in the quality of light. Morning arrives a fraction earlier. Evening lingers just a little longer along the horizon before surrendering to night. Snow still blankets the prairie, but its surface softens slightly under midday sun. You stand outside your cabin or homestead and feel something new in the air. Not warmth exactly, but possibility. Seasonal temperature records kept at frontier forts and settlements show that late winter often brought dramatic fluctuations. Days could climb above freezing only for nights to plunge again below zero. This cycle created treacherous conditions. Snow melted partially, then refroze into hard crust by morning. You walk across the yard and hear the subtle crunch of thawing snow beneath your boots. It is different from the brittle snap of deep winter. Slightly damp, slightly forgiving. Icicles hang from the eaves of your roof, long and clear as glass. Sunlight catches them, turning each into a bright shard. Drips fall steadily during warmer hours, tapping softly against packed ground. Yet caution remains essential. Early thaws sometimes misled settlers into premature optimism. Agricultural reports from the plains indicate that late-season blizzards frequently struck after brief warm spells, catching livestock and travelers off guard. You step into the barn and run your hand along a wooden beam. The scent of damp hay mingles with the faint sweetness of melting frost. There is a familiar anecdote from a Nebraska homestead in which a rancher once moved cattle into open pasture too soon after a mild week in February, only to face a sudden cold snap that followed. The lesson was costly. Winter rarely released its hold without one final reminder. Still subtle signs accumulate. Birdsong returns faintly at dawn, a sparrow or meadowlark testing its voice against the crisp air. The sound carries differently now, less lonely. Hydrologists examining river patterns in the west note that late winter thaw contributes significantly to spring runoff. Snowpack accumulation in mountain regions determined water availability for farms and towns months later. Even frozen nights were part of a larger seasonal rhythm. You kneel near the edge of the yard and brush aside a thin layer of snow where sunlight has lingered longest. Beneath the ground feels less rigid, slightly yielding. Inside the cabin you notice that the fire burns with a touch less urgency. You still bank it carefully at night, but the temperature drop feels less severe than it did weeks ago. There is a small but charming detail recorded in one settler's journal, describing how children would place tiny twigs in jars of water indoors during late winter, watching for the first buds to open as proof that spring approached. The act required patience and hope in equal measure. Researchers studying seasonal psychology suggest that even minor increases in daylight can improve mood and energy levels after prolonged winter darkness. Though frontier settlers did not measure such changes scientifically, they certainly felt them. You stand at the doorway at dusk and observe the sky turn from pale gold to lavender. Snow still blankets fields, yet its edges appear softer in the fading light. Frozen nights remain part of your routine. You still check the well, still feed the animals extra hay, still layer clothing before bed, but something in the air has shifted. There is less tension in your movements now, less dread as the evening approaches. The cabin feels sturdier, not because its walls changed, but because you know winter's grip cannot hold forever. In mountain towns, miners once watched south-facing slopes for the first signs of exposed rock marking the approach of thaw. On the plains, ranchers gauged snow depth against fence posts measuring retreat. A curious practice in some communities involved celebrating the first day when laundry could be hung outside without freezing stiff. The sight of cloth fluttering freely became a quiet milestone. You step back inside and stir the embers gently. Flames rise with familiar ease. The room glows softly comfortable rather than defensive. Winter demanded respect, and you gave it that. Through storms and isolation, through cracked ice and drifting snow, you adapted. Now as light stretches a little farther across frozen ground each day, you feel the slow easing of vigilance. Not abandonment of caution, but relaxation of constant edge. You pull a blanket over your shoulders and sit near the hearth, watching sparks lift briefly and fade. Outside the prairie remains white and still, but beneath the surface change begins quietly. Frozen nights in the Old West were chapters within a larger cycle. They tested preparation, endurance, and cooperation. They shaped habits and sharpened awareness. And now, as the horizon glows faintly with lengthening light, you sense the final pages of winter turning towards spring. You wake before dawn, not from cold this time, but from a quiet awareness that feels almost reflective. The cabin rests around you in familiar stillness. The fire has burned low again, embers glowing softly beneath a thin layer of ash. You lie still for a moment listening. The wind is gentler now. It moves across the prairie without the sharp edge it carried weeks ago. Snow still lies in drifts outside, yet it seems less imposing. The air inside the cabin holds a steady, manageable chill. You rise slowly and cross to the hearth. Kneeling, you brush aside ash carefully. Beneath a deep red glow persists patient and alive. You add a small piece of kindling and watch as flame curls upward once more. It feels symbolic somehow. Small, steady continuation rather than a desperate defense. Throughout the 19th century, countless families across the American West endured winter in ways remarkably similar to yours. Homestead records, fort journals, mining town newspapers, and personal letters all attest to the rhythm of preparation and response. Chop wood, store food, bank coals, check animals, repeat. Yet there remains discussion among cultural historians about how winter narratives shape the broader mythology of the frontier. Some argue that stories of frozen nights became exaggerated over time to reinforce ideals of toughness. Others maintain that the hardship itself required no embellishment. The cold was as fierce as memory claims. You straighten and glance around the cabin. Walls that once felt like fragile barriers now appear dependable. You have learned their drafts and sealed their seams. You have measured fuel carefully and rationed it wisely. A curious recollection preserved in a Dakota diary tells of a settler who once thanked his chimney aloud at the end of a particularly severe season, as if it were a companion rather than mere architecture. The gesture may seem whimsical, yet it captures the intimacy formed between people and the structures that sheltered them. You move toward the door and open it gently. Morning light spills across the snow in pale gold. The horizon stretches wide and clear. The cold remains present, but it no longer feels like an adversary to be conquered. It feels like a condition to be understood. You step outside and draw a long breath. The air still carries crispness, yet it lacks the piercing bite of deep winter. Snow beneath your boots has softened slightly under yesterday's sun. In the distance, a thin thread of smoke rises from another homestead chimney, a reminder that others have endured similar nights, banking fires, tucking children beneath quilts, hauling water through ice. Winter on the frontier was never a singular experience. It unfolded differently in cabins, forts, mining towns, railroad camps, and stage stations. Yet across each setting, the same principles carried you through. Careful preparation, shared warmth, attention to detail. You close the door once more and return to the hearth. The small flame you coax now burns steadily, casting gentle light across wooden walls. There is a quiet satisfaction in survival that does not require triumph. No fanfare, no proclamation, just the steady continuation of daily life. You sit on the edge of your bed and pull on your boots. The day awaits with chores and routines shaped by weeks of cold discipline. Frozen nights have left their imprint. You move with greater awareness. You notice subtle shifts in air and light more readily. You value steady fire and stored provisions more deeply. As morning advances, sunlight spreads across the snowfields beyond your cabin. The prairie glows softly, no longer hostile but serene. You pause at the window and rest your hand against the cool glass. Frost patterns melt gradually under light. The cycle continues. Winter will return again in time, perhaps gentler, perhaps harsher, but you now understand its language. You have learned how to stack logs just right, how to bank coals beneath ash, how to seal drafts with cloth and snow, how to share warmth in close quarters, how to listen to wind and silence alike. And as the fire hums quietly behind you and the sun rises slowly over frozen land, you feel not triumphant but steady. Winter demanded vigilance, you answered with patience. Now the embers glow in calm assurance and the prairie waits beneath widening light. Now as the final light of this long winter journey settles softly around you, let your thoughts slow the way embers do when they ease from flame into a gentle glow. You've walked through cabins and forts across snowbound plains and into crowded stagecoaches. You've felt the sting of wind and the comfort of shared blankets. Each frozen night required attention, yet none lasted forever. Picture the hearth now reduced to a low red shimmer. The cabin is quiet. Outside, snow reflects faint starlight, peaceful and still. There is no urgency left in the air, no storm pressing at the door, only steady warmth lingering in wooden wool. Let your breathing match the rhythm of that glow. Slow and even. The prairie beyond stretches wide and silent, but you are sheltered, prepared, safe. Winter will always have its voice, sometimes sharp, sometimes hushed. Yet you have learned how to listen without fear. So let the embers fade gently in your mind. Let the wind soften to a distant whisper. The frozen night loosens its hold and you drift toward rest beneath a vast